We will be reading from Igor Kufayev's new book. I'm super excited about Kuņdalinī The Goddess as the Power of Self-Recognition in Tantric Śaivism. We're going to skip the preface, go straight to the introduction, and on to the first chapter. There was always a sense of presence as far back as my memory can reach, a subtle feeling of great mystery underlying all events and encounters, always ready to be unveiled yet remaining unspoken, beyond the reach of any verbal expression, sealed by the way life unfolds within itself for reasons unbeknownst to reason. This is, in essence, what this book is about. An attempt at communicating what, by virtue of being enclosed within itself, can only be experienced and never conveyed in simple words or even through the most elaborate concepts. For it lies beyond any conceivable means of what we refer to as mental activity, including the most vivid forms of imagination. To name it life's greatest secret is a kind of betrayal, a cliché that varnishes the truth in any case, and as far as the term itself is concerned, the genie is out of the bottle, and has been for a while. We are now in the 3rd century in which the perennial traditions of the Orient continue to be a source of regeneration for the westernized world. India, in particular, is the largest exporter of its rich spiritual heritage, and, in relation to this topic, the exporter of knowledge which, prior to that dissemination was reserved for a select few within its largely hermeneutic traditions. Ever since Sir John Woodruff's translation of the classic tantric text Sat Chakra Nirupana, I'm going to butcher some of these, apologies, as part of his famous The Serpent Power, introduced Western audiences to the system of chakras in 1918. Carl Jung's historical seminars to the Psychological Club in Zurich in 1932, Paramahansa Yogananda's highly influential autobiography of a yogi, published in 1946, and the spiritual movements and their founding leaders as gurus to the counterculture of the 60s. The term has been popularized and firmly entered most commonly spoken languages in its original Sanskrit transliteration. There have been many publications since solely dedicated to the topic, some of highly commendable expertise, and there now seems to be no shortage of references readily available online. It is only legitimate to ask, why this one? What distinguishes this particular approach? Trusting that the unfolding pages will take one beyond the initial inquiry, it is certain that this is not an ordinary reading, nor is it a scholarly study of a given subject, even if containing bold attempts at bringing together some of the most compelling perspectives on this topic ever to be born to the human mind, or downloaded from the domain of divine beings, where everything is yet to be formed into anything tangible. This, as could be said of all true art, is a work in progress, where most of what is contained here is assembled with great attention, for it to be accessible to a reader equipped with goodwill, without downgrading this sacred knowledge to the level of populism, whilst staying true to the tradition in its fine measure for a passerby to merely dabble in. This book is, therefore, first and foremost, for those who are amidst the process at whatever stage, degree, or level, and therefore in need of reassurance, support, and perhaps most importantly, first-hand experience-based guidance. What qualifies me to speak to this extraordinarily intricate topic in the first place? Perhaps the following will place it into a context without which this undertaking would remain but a vain attempt at defining the ineffable. It was sometime in the mid-90s, during what by then were regular sittings, when my body went into a powerful and unstoppable spin. It was at once exhilarating and terrifying, and lasted for a few minutes. The spinning was literally unstoppable. It had to subside on its own, as if governed by the same force that ignited it in the first place. And of course it was, but it would take some time before that understanding was borne out of the intensity of burning, which at the time was yet to come. It was also precise, with rotations coming from the base of my spine as though I had been placed on a centrifuge, with my head in a spin corresponding, or rather coping, with the tremendously fast movement in order to remain intact upon my shoulders. When it was over, the sense of dizziness coupled with incredible lightness, serenity, and a bubbling feeling of joy spilled throughout the body as warm, glowing liquid. This experience would not repeat for years, yet my meditations remained regularly accompanied by the head swaying gently, rhythmically, side to side, like that of a Chinese doll, throughout all my sittings for the next few years. It all happened at an advanced meditation course known as the TMCD program, which I attended in my birth country of Uzbekistan. It was late, crisp autumn in 2001 when the full power of awakened life force unleashed from its dormancy, initiating the process of transformation accompanied at times by the merciless dissolution of everything I knew or considered myself to be, as I watched it being consumed by the fire of consciousness awakened to itself. It didn't take long to realize that it wasn't personal. It wasn't about me surviving it, but rather how gracefully that me was being dismantled in the otherwise unstoppable process of unfoldment. To say that my entire life had changed would be an understatement. To begin with, I was living the dream come true life of an artist in London at a point which could be considered the culmination of years of dedicated effort in how success is defined in being able to do what one loves doing, not just in terms of skin-deep level of recognition. Whatever ideas or aspirations permeated my mind at the time, all that was shaken to the core, taken over, and eventually brought to a suspenseful halt. Yet this was just the beginning. I became a meditator in my late 20s, which is considered late by many standards, and even then it was mainly due to a spontaneously initiated need to be healed from the trauma of losing my firstborn daughter, who died in a car accident at the age of 6. This loss somatically manifested over the years as a spinal injury, despite my history as an athlete turned yoga bodybending enthusiast. Yet from the very first sitting, meditation became an integral part of my daily life, a highly effective methodology, a therapy in its own right. Minimizing the stress of modern life, admittedly, it was practiced without any particular zeal to attain any higher state of consciousness. And yet, there was a buildup of heart-aching longing I did not even know I was capable of. At the time, in the last quarter of the previous century, the term Kuņdalinī, particularly where its phenomenology was visibly displayed, was primarily associated with two spiritual movements: the Siddha Yoga organization founded by Swami Muktananda, and the TM Siddhi program, an advanced offering within transcendental meditation developed by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. These movements not only popularized the term, but perhaps more significantly brought the phenomenology of awakening in its psychosomatic manifestations into full view. This was particularly evident among the followers of Siddha Yoga, where such expressions were frequent and at times striking. It is also worth noting the rise of Kuņdalinī Yoga as taught by Yogi Bhajan, a highly successful movement with many affiliated centers in the United States. Yet the inclusion of the term in its title contributed inadvertently to the proliferation of misconceptions surrounding Kuņdalinī, both as a cultural symbol and as a clinical process. Kuņdalinī Yoga bore little resemblance to what Kuņdalinī signifies within authentic yogic and tantric contexts. Outside these well-known organizations, the word circulated mostly within postural yoga communities, where it remained more of an abstract notion, tinged with exoticism, often depicted through motifs drawn from Indian folk imagery and sustained through semi-mythical accounts passed informally within spiritual circles, particularly prior to the digital era. Fast forwarding to our time, it could be said that the past 2 decades have been marked by a simultaneous rise in interest and an intensification of polemic. On one hand, there is growing curiosity. On the other, a persistent lack of shared consensus regarding the role and significance of Kuņdalinī in all phases of human development. More urgently still, there has been an increase in demand for reliable sources of information in response to the rapidly expanding demographic of individuals reporting varying degrees of activation and awakening. What is most disconcerting is not merely the extent to which Kuņdalinī is misunderstood within mainstream psychology and psychiatry, where it is routinely pathologized and treated through allopathic protocols aimed at suppressing symptomatology, often with medication detrimental to long-term well-being. But the way Kuņdalinī remains marginalized even within spiritual circles themselves. These biases are especially evident in Neo-Advaita and non-duality circles, and paradoxically within several orthodox schools of Buddhism, where such manifestations are often dismissed as peripheral or even unwelcome disturbances within otherwise homogeneous approaches to practice. These despairing attitudes arise from long-standing cultural misrepresentations within the Indian tradition itself, further colored by external interpretations, particularly when filtered through the religious paradigm of the Abrahamic worldviews. Another source of continued misconception is the tendency to speak of Kuņdalinī purely as an elaborate metaphysical principle, rather than recognizing it equally as a somatic process accompanied by a range of phenomena, including the proverbial psychic powers, those CDs, which contribute to its ambivalent reputation. Yet it is precisely this power capable of veiling the intellect from its discriminative quality of phronosis that remains at the cutting edge of every true spiritual breakthrough. Despite the growing interest in Tantric Śaivism, often referred to as a synthesis of India's most comprehensive philosophical insights, the role of Kuņdalinī within this system continues to be overlooked or, at best, marginalized by proponents of a so-called direct path. This often stems from insufficient access to or understanding of the depth of the tantric teachings among those who profess to speak on its behalf. These misconceptions will be revisited throughout this book. It is sufficient to note here that self-recognition is not a mental process. For any change to be lasting, it must take place at the level of physiology, down to the very structure of DNA. Just as the body can be seen as the seat of false identification, it is equally the locus where self-recognition becomes established. The physiology is where consciousness is crystallized, and it is in the body where it is molten again. For such a view to be meaningful, it must immediately be acknowledged that the body is not merely a few pounds of flesh composed of 7 physical tissues, but a multi-layered continuum, progressively constituted of the subtle, causal, and bliss consciousness fields, known as pankakosas. Not sure if I'm saying that correctly. To redress these omissions, the Tantric Śaiva perspective has been chosen to offer a sweeping overview of Kuņdalinī as a divinity of the highest order, whose power is second to none and who is venerated as the goddess in the Tantras. And while the reader will be invited into the elegance of a highly sophisticated metaphysical framework, the emphasis of this book rests on its integration into lived experience, ideally grounded in the heart's discernment and supported by direct experiential insight. Now, the approach here is a balancing act. The need for this knowledge to be practical, if it is to serve the individual and the demand of time, which often arrives with the urgency proportionate to the intensity of the process, while remaining true to the authenticity of the teaching. Having no direct access to the primary sources, all of which are written in Sanskrit, I am deeply indebted to the extraordinary work of scholars in the field of Tantric Śaiva studies. Their names are worthy of legend among those who have carried the flame of wisdom, not unlike the way the highest knowledge has been ignited from heart to heart in the sacred act of transmission. It is through their lucid translations that a passage was opened into the formidable world of Tantra, where, according to one of its most distinctive perspectives, language itself is understood as a garland of sound, composed of phonemes, Phonemes, and consonants, phonemes, over which Śakti presides as the supreme deity of speech, whether spoken, written, or gestural. No endeavor of this kind can proceed without due acknowledgement of the sources that have fueled this inquiry throughout its unfolding. There have been many influences over the years, but here I name those who have most directly or indirectly contributed to this work. I bow in gratitude and count my blessings for the inspiration that continues to this day. First and foremost, my acknowledgement goes to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. I was blessed to recognize him as an embodiment of that universal principle known as the Guru. I never met Maharishi and do not profess to teach on behalf of the organization he founded, yet I do consider myself his humble student and therefore a participant in that profound legacy. This acknowledgement naturally includes Maharishi's guru, Swami Brahmananda Saraswati, Jagadguru Shankaracharya of Jyotirmath of the Himalayas. From there, I bow to the great Shaivite sages and siddhas of the past who established the Trika tradition and lifted it to unparalleled heights. Vasagupta, Samananda, Uptaladeva, the incomparable Abhinavagupta, and his chief disciple, Ksemaraja. To the masters closer to our era, Sri Aurobindo Ghosh, whose letters on yoga served as my initiation into Indian philosophy. Swami Muktananda, whose later writings introduced me to the philosophy of Kashmir Shaivism, and the saintly Swami Lakshmanju, regarded as the last living master of that lineage. I extend my gratitude to the family of exceptional scholars and practitioners who received this knowledge at his side, beginning with Jayadeva Singh, whose English translations of the tradition's core scriptures, Shiva Sutras, Pratabij Hardayam, Spanda Karikas, Vijnana Bhairava, opened the gates for many of us. To Lillian Silburn for her groundbreaking Kuņdalinī, the energy of the depths, which proved invaluable in correlating some of the more complex aspects of the process explored here. Bettina Baumer for her brilliant contribution in Abhinavagupta's hermeneutics of the absolute. And finally, Mark Dykes-Kowski, apologies, whose translations of the most seminal texts and whose lucid prose were a source of spiritual nourishment back in the days when I ate scriptures for breakfast. Reading these scholars felt as illuminating as if being in the presence of those illustrious masters whose work they brought to life through their passion and dedicated work. Among others, less homogeneous sources of what went into inspiring this work is a somewhat eclectic list, yet without acknowledging these additional sources, the picture would look incomplete. I was given Joan Shivarpita Harrigan's Kuņdalinī Vidya, the science of spiritual transformation, during one of my teaching tours in California, circa 2013. Although certain aspects of the esoteric anatomy differ from those presented within the Shaivite tradition, which forms the basis of this work, the volume remains one of the most comprehensive studies of Kuņdalinī based on the lineage of Patanjali Yoga. Another book that crossed my path around the same time was Kuņdalinī Rising, Exploring the Energy of Awakening, a collection of more than 20 essays by notable voices across multiple disciplines, which offered a timely survey of the subject from as many angles as that Sounds True publication could gather at the time. Finally, a deep bow to the ancestors and to the land this body was born and nourished by. I have always felt a deep, culturally and even genetically informed resonance with Sufi mysticism. Born and raised in Uzbekistan, known as Heir to the Silk Route, a crossroads where merchants, saints, philosophers, and poets mingled, my upbringing unfolded amid the lingering breath of teachings that long predated any formal spiritual inquiry on my part. This land, a melting pot of traditions, was once home to the Khwajagan, Central Asia's enigmatic network of the masters, whose presence shaped entire communities through subtle influence, often transmitted through intricate systems of spiritual orders, most of which eventually went underground, and some assimilated into the Naqshbandi order, today the largest active lineage of its kind and one that traces its origin to Uzbekistan. The poetry of Nizami, Shadi, and Firdausi reached me before I ever heard a single verse of Rumi. I grew up on a street named after the great polymath Abu Rayhan al-Biruni, 973 to 1050, who, among his many astounding achievements, translated Patanjali Yoga Sutras into Arabic nearly 8 centuries before they were rendered into English. At a later stage in life, my inquiry into Sufi epistemology deepened and almost inevitably found its way to Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. Apologies again. Though born far from the oasis of Central Asia, in Andalusia, his influence travels on the same breadth of philosophical insights. Ibn Arabi's contemplations on presence and the unfolding of moment-to-moment creation informed the same current that would later converge, in my own understanding, with the vision articulated by Abhinavagupta. Gosh, I'm so sorry. That convergence became a living inquiry, one that has shaped not only the reflections that close this book, but the cadence by which they were written. Now to the question of lineage, qualification, function, and the role that comes with the territory of guiding others. In our day and age, characterized by the democratization of traditional forms of learning, the dethronement of many patriarchal institutions, at least in public discourse, the collapse of authority figures in both spiritual and political spheres, and a growing interest in pagan, pre-religious, and ancient shamanic forms of communion with the divine or with the laws of nature, the question of qualification and legitimacy in spiritual guidance is more blurred than ever. This is paralleled by the widespread popularization of the notion of instantaneous enlightenment, the countless offerings of the self-help industry, guru within principles, and other largely self-aggrandizing, ignorance-fortifying slogans conjured like tricks from a magician's hat on the one hand, and on the other, adolescent projections upon a would-be savior figure by those still informative stages of psychological maturity. Together, these trends fuel ongoing and often intractable polemics around what it truly takes to be of service to others, and the legitimacy that accompanies such service. Despite these prevalent tendencies, perhaps as a form of countercurrent, the importance of lineage and qualification has gained renewed momentum. It must be clarified, however, that lineage and qualification are not synonymous, even if at times there is an overlap. Each bears its own distinct imprint, as will become apparent. The value of a lineage is significant inasmuch as it legitimizes the one who has been ritually consecrated to perform associated functions, including that of initiating others, establishing a recognized continuity, and conferring a sense of authority. This, in turn, invokes confidence in the legitimacy and efficacy of the teaching and brings greater cohesiveness to the Sangha that inevitably forms around it. The qualification, however, when examined through the lens of the monistic philosophy of Tantric Śaivism, requires a more nuanced consideration, particularly regarding spiritual authority to impart grace and invoke gnosis. This was redressed by Abhinavagupta in his opus magnum, the Tantra Loka, where he challenged the rites of passage that relied solely on ritual consecration, upheld by custodians of the orthodox system of Shaiva Siddhanta prevalent at the time. Before offering an overview of this distinction, it must be acknowledged that the matter is open to misinterpretation, especially where personal preferences lean toward or against the legitimacy of assuming the responsibility of guiding others in such delicate and consequential an area as the evolution of the soul. It would be safer, perhaps, to leave this subject aside to avoid potential controversy. At the same time, it feels like an auspicious occasion to bring something out into the open, to set the record straight. For without this clarity, what would give one the necessary confidence to step into the role of a qualified guide? In his comparative analysis of the hierarchy of teachers, Abhinavagupta puts forth a compelling argument against the established order of his day concerning how spiritual authority is granted its legitimacy and status. He makes a bold case for those in whom the power of intuitive insight, known in the respective tradition as pratibha jnana, flowers as gnosis over those whose qualification rests solely on ritual initiation to perform the associated duties. He further elucidates the superiority of the spontaneously perfected guru, akalpita, over those consecrated through conventional rites. Abhinavagupta gives this arresting articulation in the following passages. From Tantra Loka, IV 40 CD through 41 AB, 42. Now, for some people, discriminating insight into reality arises spontaneously, literally from their own self, and such a guru is called innately perfected, samsiddhika, in the scriptures, since he is reliant upon that source, pratyaya, of knowledge that is his own self. The one who is in possession of true discriminating insight into reality, arising from his own self, endowed with qualification in every context without exception, is initiated and consecrated as a guru, by the goddesses of his own awareness. Among all teachers, that guru alone is celebrated as the best. This was not a mere philosophical argument for the sake of it. By reestablishing the hierarchy of teachers, Abhinavagupta reinstalls legitimizes the primacy of gnosis over the mere passing of the mantle with regard to the potency of imparting grace. It is precisely this distinction in the degree of grace, its intrinsic force, that defines and distinguishes, in Abhinavagupta's assessment, those who have themselves been recipients of Shiva's grace as an ultimate Shaktipata. For it is only such grace, unparalleled in power, that validates true succession in the ability to transmit that power to others. Emboldened by the above perspective and remaining within the bounds of the subject at hand, what is offered in this book is sanctioned by texts singular in their exposition of the topic, some of which have served as verification of what has directly cognized here through the phases of ascent. More crucially, it is through the repose and subsequent return that herald the integration of each phase of the Kuņdalinī process that this understanding continued to settle. It is this in itself that provides both the confidence and the impetus to present this knowledge as a synthesis of classical and clinical perspectives, grounded in years of working with others, especially those in the midst of the process, including those undergoing dramatic phases of spiritual emergency. Yet my inclinations are to view this work as part of an extraordinary display of its own power as it interacts within itself for the sake of its own creative freedom, endowed with an infinitude of expressions, including concealing and revealing itself along the way with each and every role arranged to heighten the impact of cosmic drama. You and I are but fragments of its untamed imagination, at times clad in attributes only to be stripped away depending on the gesture of an uncreated, ever-unfolding performance. It is as though the power appeases an innate aesthetic sensibility by undergoing a self-immolating transfiguration, mirrored in turn by a grace-bestowing, self-beatifying metamorphosis, as if to satiate itself with its own fullness, ceaselessly, boundlessly, through direct participation in what affords this unfathomable experience of being human. The book is structured in 3 parts. The first gives an overview of Kuņdalinī as a cultural symbol within the Tantric tradition, where the concept arguably arose from the need to articulate experiences that had long remained intensely intimate and esoteric by nature, corresponding to a metaphysical understanding of reality underpinning the rich traditions of ancient India. It retraces the prevalence of the term in relation to the culture from which the most refined model for the transformation of consciousness originates, and how that term has been interpreted across centuries and various spiritual traditions. Part 1 also addresses the likely root causes behind the widespread misconceptions surrounding the role and place of Kuņdalinī, misconceptions which eventually permeated all levels of society, imbuing it as a concept with all the ambiguity and cutting edge it is known for to this day. Understandably, the only reliable source to lean on when speaking of Kuņdalinī, both as symbol and as process, is what comes from the Shaiva Tantras. This is because all other traditions, even within India, arose directly or indirectly from the tantric practices of the Shaivites, grounded in their supreme philosophical doctrines, and conversely, because the extraordinary way of Shaivites assimilated everything that existed in India into their intricate body of knowledge. Some of these assimilations would later emerge as distinct yogas, margas, schools, or doctrines. It was a conscious decision to avoid a detailed description of the system of chakras as popularized in New Age literature, which largely stems from 2 sources, the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, 15th century, and more significantly, the Sat Chakra Nirupana, c. 16th century, with its elaborate account of the subtle pathways through which Kuņdalinī moves. While this book gives due attention to those pathways, it does not dwell on descriptions of the chakras themselves and their presumed psychological influences. The aim is to minimize speculation and not be sidetracked by the often mind-bending intricacies found in varying descriptions of subtle anatomy. Instead, the focus rests on the principal wheels of energy as they relate to the Kuņdalinī process and on how this is understood today within Tantric Śaivism, all of which is expounded in Part 2. Kashmir Shaivism is renowned for its systematic, direct, practical, and truly non-dual Advaita approach. Accordingly, its way of speaking about Kuņdalinī is likewise direct, practical, and precise, to the point of scientific discipline. Once again, the decision here was to omit overly detailed accounts of every chakra petal, Sanskrit letters associated with each petal, and symbolic animal associated with each center, except when such details serve to illustrate the actuality of the process through the metaphysical meaning carried by the symbol. At the same time, considerable attention is given to emphasizing core principles of Kuņdalinī's engagement within the spiritual anatomy and the intricacies through which this power enacts the unfoldment of universal consciousness. To give the structure and overview, Part 1 concerns knowledge and philosophical background, presented in a way intended to strike a certain chord in the heart. That resonance matters greatly, for true understanding requires the convergence of intellectual and intuitive insight into an orchestrated whole, ultimately leading to a heart-based illumination. Part 2 is about the process, everything related to the symptomatology of sequential unfoldment from awakening, uncoiling, rising, and merging of Kuņdalinī through all intermediate phases, culminating in greater integration and embodiment, followed by a stage of repose and the consequent return. Finally, Part 3 is dedicated to the practical aspects of integration, evaluating the importance of psychological, environmental, and physiological factors, along with the directing of volition, adoption of attitude, and an understanding of the crucial role nutrition plays in the process. The latter is of a particular interest to those who, to whatever degree, are amid intensity or fervor associated with the process, especially when adjustments are urgently required. For these reasons, Part 3 is also invaluable to those who work with, teach, or guide others in any capacity, as it offers access to formidable insights into how to align with or help others align with any stage of the process. On the use of Sanskrit terms, the term Kuņdalinī is inseparable from the culture in which it was born and has been safeguarded in the Indian subcontinent as a supreme spiritual symbol. Its origins are rooted in Vedic civilization and are inseparable from the language of the Vedas. A study such as this would feel incomplete without introducing certain key Sanskrit terms, particularly given the frequency and vibration these words carry. It has been noted that the vibrational potency embedded in such terms has the power to enliven specific aspects within our neurophysiology. In any case, many of these terms have already entered a range of modern languages and now form part of a widely shared lexicon. The first two terms, Shiva and Śakti, represent the foremost categories within the cosmological order of 36 tattvas of manifestation. When we say Shiva in this framework, we refer to ultimate reality. Shiva as pure awareness, one without a second. Shiva is the higher self, that which transcends absolutely everything, the absolute self. The nature of Shiva is unfathomable. Then comes Śakti, the power of Shiva. As the power, Śakti is always one with her source in Shiva. Shiva is Śakti, and Śakti is Shiva. What then marks the distinction between Shiva and Śakti? When used in relation to the highest category within manifestation of the tattvas, and to what they represent, there is no division of any kind. Yet the moment movement arises, however imperceptible, that movement is Śakti. This is addressed in greater detail in the chapter on the triadic aspect of Kuņdalinī. Śakti animates Shiva as she, using the gendered term, comes into power, though never apart from awareness. The dyadic relationship of Shiva-Shakti is therefore often expressed as that of pure awareness and the power of self-awareness. Shakti is the reflective power, the power of Shiva to behold his own magnificence. Endowed with absolute potency, Shakti is literally in charge of the entire manifestation. And since Kuņdalinī is another term for Shakti, the whole of creation, down to the gross elemental order, is nothing but the expression of that formidable power. That power is also spoken of as the field of pure potentiality, the reflective power of awareness on one hand, and the field of pure potentiality on the other. We could say Shiva is the static power and Shakti is the kinetic, if one is inclined toward clinical categories informed by science. And to make clear from the unfolding pages, even though Kuņdalinī may be approached as a science in its own right, in terms of personal inclination, there is a stronger propensity to view this through the eyes of artists and the hearts of poets, to approach the highest evolutionary force for what it is in essence, so as to behold the splendor of the goddess personified as knowledge. To help deepen the understanding of the Shiva-Shakti relationship, two additional terms are indispensable in Tantric vocabulary: prakasa and vimarsa. Prakasa is the luminosity of awareness as Shiva, and vimarsa is the reflective power of Shakti, by which that light is turned back upon itself, without which there could be no self-awareness in the first place. Luminous and aware of itself. I often use the round shape of a rubber band, symbolizing oneness, and twist it into an infinity figure 8, to demonstrate this dynamic. One becomes two, yet remains one. The slight rotation produces a creative tension without perturbing unity. That is the relationship between prakasa and vimarsa, luminosity and the power of self-reflection as an ever-present creative tension inherent within oneness. Prakasa and vimarsa are qualities of the absolute and the power of being aware of itself. One in two, two in one yet two, two yet one. It takes two to tango, even though it is one dance, one movement, one embrace. The implications of this dyadic Shiva-Shakti relationship, exemplified by the luminosity of awareness and the power of self-awareness to reflect light back upon itself, help clarify certain recurring paradoxes in contemporary spiritual discourse. Assertions such as become aware of awareness or being aware of being aware, however well-intentioned, often inadvertently rely on formulations that can lead to unresolved inner paradoxes or unrealistic expectations. One cannot be aware of awareness unless awareness is momentarily posited as an object of contemplation. This may hold value as a method of approaching the ineffable, but it is not the same as what those phrases attempt to imply. Let us pause here. How could one be aware of awareness? Awareness is that which is aware. Whatever enters the field of awareness is instantly recognized within itself through the reflective triad of knower, means of knowledge, and known. The instrumental configuration through which any experience arises. Though the individual is Shiva in disguise, it cannot be aware of Shiva, for the individual is itself an object within Shiva's contemplation. This is merely an initial framing of a topic we will explore in greater depth in the following chapter. To speak of being aware of awareness presupposes a subtle cognitive or perceptual activity of some kind, however faint. Such wording, now widely used in non-dual and neo-Advaita circles in an effort to gesture toward the highest truth, risks inviting an endless regress of being aware of being aware of being aware. Perhaps these expressions attempt to reinterpret the spirit of mindfulness, the foundational Buddhist orientation toward presence, but discernment is required to avoid conflating mindfulness with awareness in its essence. Introducing prakasa and vimarsa brings further clarity to the relationship between unfathomable being and the power of self-awareness. Vimarsa, as the quality of Shakti, is literally the entire manifestation. From this perspective, being, as Shiva, is aware of itself through Śakti as it beholds, in the world and as the world, its own reflection and embodiment. This is the true definition of Vimarsa Śakti. Śakti animates Shiva and the whole of manifest reality. The marvel of creation that we experience daily through the senses, through all the apertures, through the organs of cognition, is set into motion. When we speak of reflective awareness, it is not a cold mirror into which awareness stares with detachment. The sages of Kashmir Shaivism were quick to challenge that metaphor, to avoid reducing the dynamic relationship to the inert surface of a looking glass. Far from it. That reflective power is alive, pulsing with all the possibilities held within Shiva and brought forward through Śakti as an expression of unfettered power for creative freedom. These are fundamental aspects of the Tantric teaching, which will, in time, become clear and cognizable within one's own process, for this is what Kuņdalinī is about. There are phases when one may be swept off one's feet by the sheer intensity of the unfolding, as many are today, largely because there is insufficient philosophical or edifying ground upon which to stand. This has been one of the primary incentives behind this work, to foster a systematic understanding and introduce a synthesized approach to the process in terms of its psychological and neurophysiological dimensions. Being so-and-so, experiencing the seeming marvel of the world, and then suddenly finding oneself amid the upheaval that true awakening often brings, without warning. When the proverbial all hell breaks loose becomes the daily reality, one is often left trying to simply to get by, improvising moment to moment. Another important concept related to the esoteric body of Kuņdalinī is that of the point of emission in Sanskrit, Bindu Visarga. The Bindu is referred to as a drop of energy and a point of origination, a singularity, a compact mass of consciousness. Traditionally, it is considered a vital seed, Shiva's supreme semen, and is placed iconographically at the innermost center of the triangle, the symbol of Yoni, of the yantra representing the goddess. A dimensionless center, symbolized by the crescent moon with the dot suspended above it, the Bindu is correlated with the activity of the pineal gland and thus holds significance in relation to the lunar phases. It is at this point of emission, Visarga, that diversity springs from primordial sound. As that frequency differentiates, layers of sound manifest as ever more diverging waves, eventually becoming the crystallized structure of what we perceive as material creation through the senses. In essence, all phenomena are sound condensed into varying gradients of frequency as form. This progressive crystallization is mirrored in the relationship between mental projection and appearance, what the Vedic tradition refers to as namarupa, name and form. The Bindu carries immense significance as the point of emission from which manifestation proceeds and into which it is withdrawn in the form of sound. In its higher phases, the Kuņdalinī process is inseparable from the activation of Bindu Visarga. In correspondence with the secretional activity of the pineal gland. The term will reappear throughout this work, particularly in relation to the Ascent. A sound psychological ground, pratistha, the inner establishment that allows experience to settle without fragmenting, is essential to contain any transformation. Without it, perception becomes unsteady, shaped by projection, and strained by an influx of energy unlike anything previously encountered. This is particularly evident during the Kuņdalinī process. Pattern-driven responses can turn awakening into a period of profound destabilization. Progress followed by regression is not unusual, not because the process is failing, but because that ground has not yet stabilized. This is why the company one keeps holds such significance. Those with direct experience can help maintain pratistha during phases that feel like spiritual emergency, offering reassurance that pacifies doubt and supports the necessary surrender. These trials are, in truth, part of maturation into what it means to be a human. where the threshold between breakdown and breakthrough is crossed. In that light, the very notion of being human is gradually redefined. Kuņdalinī is esoteric knowledge. Esoteric because it concerns an inner process so subtle that one can truly say Kuņdalinī is never experienced. What we experience as the manifestations that accompany the process. Kuņdalinī is not an object. Just as light illuminates all things while falling back into itself as consciousness, Kuņdalinī illumines experience, yet remains ungraspable. Completeness of realization occurs precisely because that recognition does not arise within the framework of individual consciousness. It is the reversal of that framework, through the gradual withdrawal of mental constructs and pranic currents that shape the sense of individuality in the first place. And here we touch upon a more fundamental dimension of life. If we are utterly honest, what does every human being seek? What is the common yearning beneath all divergent pursuits? Whatever our outer strategies, existence revolves around fulfillment. And yet fulfillment often appears fleeting, evading us just as it comes into view, as though life were structured to divert us from its source. Some teachings are blunt in exposing this tension, others more accommodating, yet inevitably we discover that fulfillment is not acquired. It is revealed from the very depth that gives rise to the yearning itself. At that point, the path and destination cease to appear as separate territories. Some throw themselves into the world with restless urgency, others retreat in an effort to mend it from a safer distance. A few refrain from both, convinced the world is ultimately unreal and therefore not worth intervention. Yet whether through immersion, withdrawal, or metaphysical dismissal, the movement is often propelled by the same unexamined deficit. What fuels activism, what informs critique, and even what justifies apathy is frequently rooted in the absence of innate contentment. We eventually discover, sometimes through exhaustion rather than insight, that what we strive to mend out there echoes a disturbance in here. Even the seemingly noble impulse to change the world, or the ostensibly elevated stance of disregarding it as an illusion, can be a displaced gesture toward addressing what remains unresolved within. When effort, avoidance, and detachment each fail to offer enduring resolution, consciousness itself becomes the last and only viable frontier. Transformation then ceases to operate as a strategy and instead becomes the ground from which response, whether expressed as action, quietude, or unforced vision, arises in its own clarity. Kuņdalinī, long veiled beneath layers of symbol and secrecy, often evoked as the ancient serpent curled in the depths, embodies an intensity that cannot be neatly categorized. It conceals within itself both the impulse toward transfiguration and the potential for unraveling, depending on the state of the vessel it inhabits. In classical imagery, she rests 3.5 coils deep in the body's interior, inebriated by her own potency, inward turned, dormant yet alert. In that intoxication lies both concealment and promise. The power is present, but it remains unclaimed, unrecognized. Across cultures and epochs, this force has been guarded, courted, feared, and sought because it touches the very threshold between limitation and the possibility of renewal. Though language shifts, the underlying impulse remains, a longing to access what grants coherence and vitality from within. In contemporary terms, one might speak of the subtle orchestration of neuroendocrine processes, where the rekindling of latent mechanisms offers a pathway toward genuine equilibrium. When inner capacities lie dormant, deprivation follows, often compelling reliance on external means to approximate an internally generated state. Viewed in this way, the increasing dependence on stimulants and substitutes reflects less a cultural flaw than a symptom of estrangement from our own regenerative potential. It is quite possible that Kuņdalinī, both as symbol and as process, has received such ambivalent treatment across traditions precisely because of its unpredictable nature when awakened. Despite the dangers inherent in tampering with this cosmic force, the incentives, whether towards transformation of consciousness or access to the riches of the psychic realm, depending on what was held in highest regard, have historically outweighed what we would today consider common sense. Hence, the perennial attraction-aversion, not unlike the visceral reaction one has on encountering a serpent in the wild. And we are not invoking here the oft-cited Vedantic analogy of mistaking a rope for a snake, so widely repeated in contemporary non-dual circles, but pointing toward the very essence of the process itself, and why its unfolding can be volatile. For it is in the nature of consciousness to contain that unpredictability. What we are collectively experiencing today, whatever term we apply to this fraught state of global affairs, cannot be separated from the condition of consciousness itself, caught in that paradoxical state of being intoxicated by its own poison. And yet, the awakening of Kuņdalinī and what the goddess embodies is the power of ultimate healing. Consider the prominence that trauma now holds in modern spiritual discourse alongside the sobering recognition of how profoundly destabilizing the culture we inhabit has become. If we look carefully at what occurs in the psyche at its subtlest level, it becomes evident that without the knowledge of Kuņdalinī, and above all, without proper unfolding of the process, healing remains incomplete. For Kuņdalinī, as the root force behind individuation, is the only power capable of uprooting what binds the content of experience, metabolizing what lies unprocessed at the cellular level, both individually and collectively. Thus, the same energy that holds the potential for venom is also the source of nectar. There is an ancient image whispered in the hymns of early India of a subtle distillation drawn from above, filtering gently into the vessel of the body to nourish what is most vital. It is at once a metaphor, a riddle, and a recognition that the essence sustaining life descends through refinement. What those seers intuited was not merely the search for immortality, but a remembrance of what the body already holds as its quiet inheritance, the power to transmute longing into presence. If we listen carefully, the hymns may tell less of a quest than of a return. They intimate that the very thirst driving our restless pursuits is the trace of a deeper possibility, that what feels like absence is the doorway through which fullness re-enters. In this light, desire is not the problem, but the pressure point through which awareness turns inward. As with the image of the serpent encircling its own tail, what seeks resolution is already poised within the very fold of its longing. And so the journey need not cover any distance. What the ancients named as gods reside fully embodied in the field we call the human physiology. Each aperture of perception, every organ of cognition, a point of meeting between consciousness and form. These subtle thresholds are where infinity is meant to be tasted, and where Kuņdalinī begins her true unfolding. I invite you to ponder this in your own way as we step into what unfolds. Igor Kufayev, Saint Jean, Mallorca, Autumn 2025. O Bhairavī, terrifying in beauty, beatific in wrath, you who fashion worlds from silence and dismantle pretense with a glance, we bow in recognition, in awe, in reverence and love. Mother of time and the one who devours it, she whose breath gives rise to stars and absorbs their light, illumine the path not with comfort, but with clarity that spares nothing untrue. Guide this work to serve those whose longing burns too deep for consolation. You who pierce the mask of becoming to bear the incandescent ground of being, let these words ripen from silence, tempered in the marrow of surrender, resonant with what cannot be taught, yet eager to be known, hidden as the shiver before breath, revealed as the flame where identity shatters. Grant us the courage to speak from that interval where form melts into fire, and fire sinks back into stillness. By the grace of your descent, may these words carry the quiet fragrance of truth. O soothe where heat is fierce, to ignite where slumber runs deep, to accompany those who walk the narrow threshold between dissolution and emergence. We prostrate at your feet, O Kuņdalinī Ma, serpent power curled at the root of creation. She who burns impurity to ash and distills wholeness from the embers. Reveal only what you choose, conceal what must remain unseen. Let nothing here arise for display, nor lean toward vanity or persuasion. Let each line be an offering, breath return to breath, flame return to flame. Cast back into your boundless embrace. O Bhairavī, may this work emerge, unfold, and dissolve as your own gesture of love and of annihilation. Part 1, the symbol. Chapter 1, the great pervasion. Moi. The nature of experience. What would be a befitting point of departure to gain access to those traditions known to be at once courteous, elusive, yet unapologetic when addressing the goddess and speaking to her power? Tantra, though direct in its approaches, leans towards the inexplicable when it comes to attempts at defining the power, for that in itself is considered to be in the domain of the goddess, who herself is the guardian of all languages. She is the one who illumines it all, forever remaining beyond the grasp of the dichotomized nature of mind. It is perhaps for that reason the only legitimate way to gain access to the knowledge, gnosis, to approach the goddess is through an active invocation, initiation, and oblation, offering, which in turn opens up the subtle dimension for meditation as the methodology to be fruitful. This is not exclusive to Tantra. All Hermetic traditions are known to share this emphasis, born of the necessity for creating the point of entrance, most succinctly encapsulated in the 3 parts of Gayatri mantras, consisting of invocation, vidmahi, meditation, dhimahi, and appeal, prokadiyat, which means in order to gain access to the divine, we praise the divine, we meditate upon it, and finally we appeal to the divine to dispel the ignorance and establish our intellect in the light of true knowledge. Having this cleared, while hopefully humbled and elevated by this understanding, and most importantly, having gained access on the subtle plane, we are now ready to look into it from the perspective common to us all, experience. We are experiencing all the time, always. Life, this embodied perspective, is based on experience. We could go even further and say experience is all there is. From what is immediately available through the senses as we go about our day, to what we experience when the senses withdraw into the mind, when the dreaming state of consciousness takes over, to that of deep sleep. It is in deep sleep when everything is withdrawn into the causal, in the void of the heart, where all pranic activity has subsided, when we fall into the velvet nothingness of deep rest. Even so, that nothingness is still an experience. Otherwise, how could we be so certain of what deep sleep is known for? The analogy can be taken further. That same subtlety of continuously experiencing something is ever present, even throughout some of the most formidable spiritual experiences. We certainly experience something in meditation. Maybe at first we're experiencing the realization that the mind cannot yet settle down, that there is this mental chatter. In fact, as soon as we sit down to meditate, there is more awareness of that chatter because prior to sitting down, we did not have the chance to allow enough space to become aware of it. But in meditation, there is suddenly this thought, that thought, a train of thoughts. Experiencing these thoughts, and yes, even witnessing these thoughts, is an experience. Then as the thought process begins to slow down and as the mind gradually quietens, we begin to experience a more settled state. So settled, in fact, that at some point we no longer have any thoughts. thoughts become more and more abstract. They begin to dissolve in the firmament of the subtler dimensions of the mind until the mind subsides to such a degree that we do not experience anything, no mental activity at all. It may be accompanied by a certain opening, a vast area of spaciousness being experienced as the skies suddenly dawn and take over. This is still an experience. Even in these moments of transcendence, there is still something going on that allows us, upon coming out from these subtler states, to declare, "What a profound meditation I've had. What a profound state I was in." Maybe it was deeply peaceful, deeply settled and quiet. Perhaps it was exhilarating in the sense that it was accompanied by this bubbling sense of joy, this bliss. Or it was the indescribable experience of vastness, of being completely beyond anything that confines us to this otherwise mundane experience of being so-and-so. In all of these, experience precedes what we then can relate and convey, or leave to ourselves, never to be expressed. Now, for an experience to take place, there has to be an experiencer, the process of experiencing, and that what is being experienced. In other words, subject, means of knowledge, and object. This great triad is all there is when it comes to the nature of experience. Everything is made of that. From gross experience to the most profound internal experience, from any contemplation to experiences in altered states of consciousness that take our breath away, all contain these modalities of subject, means of knowledge, and object. This triad will form the thread that runs throughout this study as an access point into the working of Kuņdalinī in terms of this manifestation and in terms of the dynamics of what is commonly referred to as human experience. It is these three modalities that together are called the triadic heart of awareness. And although we will tap into various traditions, we will draw primarily from the perspective of Tantric Śaivism. In Tantric Śaivism, the term Trika, as the name implies, means made of three, and deals with the three aspects comprising the entire creation. These are Shiva, Śakti, and Nara. Shiva stands for the absolute, one without a second, awareness. Śakti stands for that power of Shiva, forever one with Shiva, to contemplate its own essence. Śakti is self-awareness, the reflective power of awareness, that which allows contemplation of its own essence through reflective power of its own. And Nara stands for this individual experience in and as the world. The union of these three is the core teaching of Tantric Śaivism, expanded through its main doctrines, and this is what makes it into a body of knowledge. This triadic nature of experience is made of the knower, knowing, and known, referred to in the Tantric Śaiva philosophy as Pramatar, Pramana, and Pramaya. Pramatar is the eternal subject, Pramana, the power of knowing, and Pramaya, the known. Those who come from the Vedic tradition know it as the union of the observer, observing, and observed. In Sanskrit, Samhita of Risi Divata Chandas, where Samhita stands for the union, togetherness of Risi, the knower, Divata, the knowing, and Chandas, the known. These are all expressions of the powers of self-awareness just prior to the process of manifestation, projected as indispensable aspects which together make the power of will, power of knowledge, and power of action. The power of will is the expression of pure subjectivity of any subject. The power of knowledge is that which makes anything into a possibility of knowing, that which connects the subject with the object. In other words, the relationship between subject and object is seized and made steadfast by that universal power of knowledge. And knowledge in turn is naturally expressed in and through the power of action. In Sanskrit, this is expressed as Icha, Jnana, Kriya. Icha, will, Jnana, knowledge, and Kriya, action, here form the complete that equilateral, that triangle, that trinity, that triad of awareness, without which there is no experience. This is how Kuņdalinī as consciousness creates the world and hides itself in every experience by continually expressing her unlimited power throughout manifestation. Again, that triadic relationship, the relationship between subject and object, is made steadfast through the modality of knowing, which is empowered by a specific quality of awareness. In Sanskrit, these modalities altogether are known as Śakti, power of will, Jnana Śakti, power of knowledge, and Kriya Śakti, power of action. These modalities are universal and can be spoken of in terms of the impulses of creative intelligence, with the will as an expression of the knower, the knowledge as an expressive potentiality of the process of knowing, and the action as the expressive potentiality of the object or the known. This relationship is dynamic, supremely subtle, elusive, and is what paves the way for diversity, if we are to speak of it in terms of manifestation as the process. Just as an example, I'm experiencing this room right now where I write, and through the open window I'm hearing the sounds outside, the chirping of birds, barking of a dog, and the sound of cars in the distance. There is this sense of an all-pervading daylight filling the room I'm in, playfully bouncing off an arrangement of wildflowers on the bench, or whatever else may come in view, through the retina or any other aperture of my sensory perception it belongs to. All this is a constant expression of that which these three modalities are made of as consciousness in motion. At this very moment, as you are reading these words, you are the subject experiencing this, and my voice through the pages, so to speak, presents itself as an object of your experience. The very nature of experience is this triadic relationship of the knower, the process of knowing, and the known. That triad is illumined by the one and only absolute reality, and within the Shaiva tradition is named Anuttara. Forever beyond all its aspects, Anuttara transcends all planes of manifestation, and yet Anuttara is what illumines it all. We will speak about it in greater detail, how all this is set in motion, and how manifestation cascades down, as it were, through the myriad of successive phases. But before it does, this triad, referred to as the triadic heart, becomes a possibility because these are the powers inherent in awareness as expressions of a supremely creative act which requires the dynamic relationship of subject and object. Irrespective of whom we consider ourselves to be, irrespective of where we are in terms of our understanding, in terms of our spiritual orientation or total lack thereof, in terms of our achievements or failures, in terms of how intelligent or not we are about these matters, that triadic dynamic is always intact in absolutely every one of us because the nature of being alive is experience. And to experience is to be subjected to the interplay of these triadic modalities. Experience is everything, for everything is made out of experience. As far as these impulses of creative intelligence are concerned, they are the agencies at the highest level of universal administration. When you look at something, how that in you, which looks, that subject, recognizes anything, is because of that knowledge of how, which connects the subject with an object of your experience. We could add that the subject recognizes itself or recognizes itself in the object, which is what is taking place if we are to speak of it in terms of the ultimate state of affairs. Yet at the level of human experience, these modalities should also work without any glitch, even if at the expense of concealing the light that illumines it all. Obviously, this extends to all 5 sensory perceptions: hearing, touching, seeing, tasting, smelling. Everything that is in the realm of sensory experience follows that same triad of experience. Moreover, take any mental activity. There is the thinker and there is the thought. That relationship of thinker and the thought is also steadfast here and is an expression of those very same powers of Icha, Jnana, and Kriya Shaktis, respectively coming together to make comprehension possible. From the mundane thought of, I am thirsty, to the sublime, I am the absolute, to acknowledge any sensation, such as the atmospheric sensations of heat or cold or breeze or the lack thereof, to the emotional state of any experience, there are these dynamics at play. All this is made of the aforementioned powers of awareness expressing themselves as will, knowledge, and action, with the subject representing that eternal I, the knowledge as that which connects the subject and object representing the you in every language, and that which stands as an object of experience representing that other, be it with the reference to a sentient or insentient being. And of course, this is, as we have said, a supremely dynamic affair. That I, you, and that is what completes the triangle of experience, or the seer, the seeing, and the seen. And creation is said to be set in motion with all its ensuing repercussions, some of which are blindly accepted as misperceived reality, which in turn goes on to make up the bound soul trapped in the interplay of its own energies. The importance of the triad will become more apparent in the unfolding pages, affording us insights into the process of Kundalini's descent as the world, or a world of forms and phenomena, and possibly as a consequence of that descent, assuming this individual experience we all refer to as human existence. Conversely, the transfiguration of those energies heralds a greater intimacy of the subject-object dynamics, in some cases leading to the direct recognition of our essence, which is impossible without transcending the very modalities which constitute experience itself. When the constituents of experience are equipoised to a state of universal balance, then the dynamic subject-object tension is said to be restored to its equilibrium, which otherwise is in perpetual oscillation as eternal subject, the experiencer, and object as that which is being experienced. May the above serve as an entrance into the basic tenets of what Tantric Śaivism operates with in terms of its modalities aimed at expressing the formidable relationship of Shiva, Śakti, Nara, which in turn could be spoken of in terms of awareness interacting within itself through the reflective power of self-awareness, along with what gives rise to individual experience. Etymology of Kuņdalinī. Whenever we say Kuņdalinī, it almost asks for a certain pause. For when it comes to this term, we often run the risk of trivialization whenever a topic is given to casual discourse, unless it comes from someone with initiatory insight into the tradition where the term itself originates. Especially nowadays, when so much has been said and written about that power, one wonders what else can be added, whether adding anything would contribute to further bias as to what this power truly represents. In light of this, let us tread attentively lest we be prompted to jump into hasty conclusions or lean on readily available labels. To us modern people, this may seem an overstatement, but to approach this topic is nothing short of approaching the goddess. It requires reverence and understanding, particularly when viewed through the eyes of the respective traditions encapsulated in the many tantric scriptures known as the Shiva and Shakti agamas. The Sanskrit term Kundalini is most commonly translated as the coiled one. The root Kundalini, as an adjective, denotes something circular, spiral-like in form. As a noun, it conveys the sense of something curled or coiled. The most immediate interpretation is of Kundalini as a power coiled 3.5 times around the linga, lying as if in a self-imposed slumber. Other associations extend to the root kunda or kundi, a pot, linked ritually to the yoni-shaped receptacle where a linga is placed for offerings, into which libations such as milk are poured and flow outward as sacrificial offering. I just got a Shiva lingam. Looks like the mountain symbol on the new Gorillaz album. Sort of. Anyway, pretty incredible. I love this thing. Yeah. We were just talking, yes. Yep. The imagery of coiled evokes the serpent in repose, poised yet potent. In many accounts, Kundalini is depicted as coiled. Did I say that? I did. I didn't. Is depicted as, I think I didn't. Yeah, I didn't. Is coiled 3.5 times, with each coil aligned to a primordial force of nature, the gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. The three are capped by a half-turn, a symbol of transcendence beyond all modalities, hidden in the midst of the immanent. In this coiled state, Kuņdalinī contains the full latent potential of her springing ascent, much like a spiral compressed with energy that, once released, unfurls with irresistible force. The association with serpent imagery is not arbitrary. It is supported in early Shaiva tantras where Kuņdalinī is understood simultaneously as the contracted potency of speech and sound, Vak, Sabda, Śakti, and as the latent force coiled at the base of the body, Si Pado Vak, the concept of the word in selected Hindu tantras, Silburn, Kuņdalinī, energy of the depths. Within the earliest strata of Tantric Śaivism, texts like the Tantra Sabhava and the Malanivajayotara Tantra, super apologies, placed at the foundation of the school by Alexis Sanderson, the term Kuņdalinī already denotes this primal Śakti, inseparable from awareness, Siti itself. Here she is not merely serpent power in a physiological sense, but the vibratory contraction of consciousness into a point of view capable of unfurling upward through the Susumna. Later yogic and hatha sources such as the Hatha Yoga Pradipaka and the Sat Chakra Nirupana would emphasize the literal image of the serpent coiled at the base of the spine. It is this layer that cemented the now familiar definition of Kuņdalinī as the coiled energy. Some scholars like Christopher Wallace in his essay, What is Kuņdalinī?, have questioned whether this emphasis on coiled is an interpretive narrowing of earlier tantric nuance. His caution reminds us that the term should not be reduced to a single metaphor but understood in the broader metaphysics of Trika, where contraction and expansion, repose and ascent are the very rhythm of consciousness. Lillian Silburn's account remains seminal for modern readers. Out of Kuņdalinī, Energy of the Depths, page 15. As such a name implies, the curled one with a sinuous body, when lying coiled and dormant in the body, may be compared to a snake. Just as the snake, an object of dread because of its poison, stands as a symbol of all evil forces, as long as she lays motionless within us, Kuņdalinī is related to our obscure, unconscious energies, both poisoned and poisonous. However, once they are awakened and under control, these same energies become effective and confer a true power. Kuņdalinī resembles a snake also in the way that she emits her venom. When it wants to bite, the serpent swings around, forming a circle with its tail for support. Once it stands erect, it is no longer dangerous at all. In the same way, as soon as Kuņdalinī uncoils and rises, straight like a staff, to the top of the head, not only does she become harmless, but as the evil nature of her power is transformed, she proves to be a priceless treasure. This enigmatic metaphor, drawn by an eminent tantric scholar of her day, of Kuņdalinī as serpent power, has been depicted throughout the long history of the Orient and of Indian culture in particular. This may also explain why in the Occident, especially within the Abrahamic traditions, Kuņdalinī has often been viewed as a negative force, sometimes even equated with the satanic. One still encounters these perspectives in certain Christian circles, which stigmatize the very same power that brought some of Christianity's most illustrious mystics into direct communion with the divine. Perhaps the roots of this perplexing attitude lie in the time when spiritual revelation became institutionalized, transformed into an instrument of power that demanded a decisive break with the pagan ways of life. Many of those older practices were grounded in intimacy with the land and nature and carried totemic symbolism where certain animals, above all the serpent, were revered as signs of vitality and as guardians of the threshold between spirit and materia prima. Across ancient cultures, the snake embodied both the fertility of earth and the mystery of life germinating in its dark soil. In this light, the serpent was honored as protector of that liminal realm between the transcendent and immanent. Such a view is not unlike the metaphysical concepts widespread across Eastern terrains, where the serpent is recognized as a source of both poison and healing of the psyche, an ambivalence central to the tantric traditions themselves. speaking of the poisonous side of Kuņdalinī, also evokes the myth of Shiva Nilakantha. In the Vishnu Purana, when Devas and Asuras churned the cosmic ocean in search of Amrita, the nectar of immortality, what first surfaced was a deadly poison capable of destroying the worlds. Shiva, in his compassion, swallowed it to preserve creation. Parvati's consoling embrace and healing garlands soothed his suffering, yet the venom lodged in his throat, staining it eternally blue. This is no incidental detail. The throat, the realm of Visuddha chakra, is traditionally associated with akasa, or ether, the element of resonance, space, and vibration. It is here, according to many tantric sources, that streams of nectar and poison divide. The subtle physiology wherein what is life-sustaining is distinguished from what is toxic, what can be assimilated from what must be held back. Read in this light, the myth offers less of a direct map of Kuņdalinī, but rather a resonant analogy of her dialectic. The same stirring that releases nectar also stirs poison. The same current that destabilizes also purifies. The throat, as the liminal place of containment, becomes a crucible for that alchemy. Kuņdalinī, too, in her passage, awakens what is unsimilated and forces it toward transmutation, even as she releases the sweetness of higher awareness. To invoke this metaphor here is admittedly to run ahead of ourselves. This is only a taste, and we will unfold the theme in its fullness later in the book, when the dialectic of poison and nectar is revisited as a key to the process as a whole. Even so, it already hints that the power called Kuņdalinī cannot be grasped without acknowledging the paradox she embodies. She is both peril and grace, venom and elixir, held together in a single current of transformation. This poison, or more precisely, this poisonous energy of the serpent, finds its reflection in the psyche as those toxic attitudes and unconscious drives that pervade our existence so long as we remain asleep to our essential nature, which is what Kuņdalinī in her state of slumber represents. For as long as we remain unconscious, as long as the power of consciousness lies coiled upon itself, we are subject to the effects of this venom diffused throughout our being. Hence the warning of the dormant serpent. And indeed, there is danger inherent in the process itself. Before the serpent power has fully uncoiled and risen erect, it carries the undeniable threat of striking. Once upright, however, Kuņdalinī alters her nature entirely. Her verticality signifies the fullness of awakening. When the power uncoils through the entire network of subtle pathways and the body becomes steady enough to host her ascent. What is implied here by poison, in psychological terms, is that vast domain of unconscious material which, prior to Kuņdalinī's awakening, remains hidden from awareness. Our ordinary consciousness has no access to it. This is what makes the genuine stirring of Kuņdalinī so formidable, overwhelming, and even shocking to the psyche. As the unconscious is released from its depths, the process is often accompanied by phases of acute psychological challenge, for much of that material had previously lain beyond reach. Put simply, there was not yet enough consciousness to contain or illumine it. These releases necessarily express themselves in dramatic somatic ways, sensations, upheavals, and movements at the physiological level, because the body is the very place where all impressions are stored and must be resolved. In a true awakening, this surfacing of the unconscious is accompanied by an outpouring of unprocessed impressions, the long embedded traces of past experiences, patterns of conditioned behavior born of survival strategies and psychological dependencies, as well as desires left unfulfilled or even unacknowledged. All that had remained beneath the threshold of awareness is now flushed into the open, brought to the surface of consciousness to be seen, felt, and released. This can be deeply unsettling, yet belongs integrally to every authentic process of transformation. There is no genuine freedom without first being liberated from these psychic impositions, hence the old axiom, before freedom, there must be freedom from. The Trinity. Let us consider this triadic relationship in the form of an equilateral triangle resting on its side. At the top, we will have Shiva, the eternal subject. At each of its corners, we have Śakti and Nara, respectively. This dynamic is represented by how subject is experiencing object for the sake of the seer, in turn giving rise to a relationship without which there is no dynamism and no diversity. This is not some random accident or impurity on the part of the experiencer, that these three constitute the nature of experience. Rather, experience itself reveals the very nature of that which is at the substratum of all experiencing. Moreover, this triadic relationship is one of supreme fluidity. What we have from our individualized perspective is that the subject is often being lost in the object of its experience, with the intermediary power assisting that, the power of knowledge here exemplified by Jnana Śakti. And in the same way, the subject regains its authority as that which sets everything in motion when the objectivity of experiencing is subjectified. This is true to even the most mundane experience of, let's say, I'm making tea. There is an active will that swells me to have some tea. It is being carried by the power of knowing how to do it, only to manifest to the act of tea being enjoyed. The act of tea making is completed here. Once the act, the performance is completed, the subject can regain itself from that experience, which maybe momentarily caused the subject to lose its subjectivity in the objective sphere of any particular experience. This is where we come close to understanding the dynamics behind the Kuņdalinī process. For just as this is true to all of what we experience minutely on a daily basis as we go through life, this very principle is intact when it comes to the process of self-realization. Just as Shiva, the eternal subject, and Śakti, as the reflective power of consciousness, the power of knowledge here is that power of consciousness, is administering Shiva's descent into the objective sphere of experience, all the way to Nara, to the state of this, in Sanskrit, idam. What we have now is I, you, and this, where the I stands for the singularity of Shiva, you for the dynamic force of Śakti, and this stands for the world. Everything is now set in motion, and from here on, empowered by the ceaseless interplay of will, icha, knowledge, jnana, and action, kriya, this grand descent of pure subjectivity into the objective sphere of experience of the world, for the sake of its own enjoyment, so as to perhaps recover itself, is the very meaning behind that triadic relationship and the bewildering hide and seek in that equilateral. The dynamics within the equilateral can be found in other traditions, for example, that of the Gnostic Trinity, represented by the theological principle of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, with the Father standing for the never-changing infinite Spirit, the Son, the ever-changing finite manifestation as the world, and the Holy Ghost as the divine feminine power, the great mother which gives birth to and nurtures the world, and ultimately takes it back into the eternal spirit of the Almighty Absolute. The Holy Ghost of Gnostics is the Śakti of Tantrikas, and the Pneuma of the soul-animated power of breath in its all-encompassing presence expressed as Kuņdalinī at the level of human incarnation as Logos. Here, literally as that Christian Word made flesh, John 1:14. This interpenetration is of particular importance in its analogy to the monistic, all-encompassing philosophy of Tantric Śaivism, which recognizes the world to be one with awareness in all its aspects and attributes, none of which are short of being divine through and through. Now the process of regaining pure subjectivity is through transfiguration, the reverse of how it was lost, with Śakti as the means. The individualized consciousness, Nara, here aching to regain its identity, longing for a communion with the essence, Shiva, is not dissimilar to the way Shiva, swelled by desire to behold its magnificence through diversity, lost or hides its identity in the object of its contemplation as the world. Hence the tantric axiom, Shiva is the goal, Śakti is the means. For it is Śakti that delivers and ultimately unites the individualized consciousness with universal awareness. To break it down into main phases with an eye on this grand triad, and from the point of view of individual existence, any real shift in identity is facilitated by the energetic aspect of knowledge, Śakti. When we speak of creation and human consciousness as a point of balance, the act of concealment and revelation is assisted by the same power applied to different poles of its extremes, where identity is checked by the very same power that robs us of our universal essence in the first place, as if driven by unspoken laws of theatrics, without which there is no heart-rending catharsis to heal the cosmic rupture. Kashmiri sage Abhinavagupta, 10th century, compared this act to a dancer who comes on stage, does her performance, and goes off the stage. This mini performance is the replica of Shiva as the spectator, for whose sake Śakti, the self-reflective power of Shiva, comes to quench his thirst for entertainment, only to fall back on the self as soon as the spectacle is over. This happens at the minutest level of everything that we experience on a daily basis, at an infinitesimal level, imperceptible by the mind. It happens as this and every moment blends into the next, all seamlessly joining each of its countless frames, ceaselessly throbbing in rhythmical movement, tangibly felt here as the rising and falling of your diaphragm, a metronome of sorts to render infinity each and every breath at a time. In the grand scheme of things, the rise and collapse is all there is, and it is taking place at the micro, imperceptible level. But what we end up with is that seamless nature of experience itself. This is what happens to us all, irrespective of where we find ourselves in life, all the way to where we may find ourselves amidst the most profound and overwhelming event that Kuņdalinī as process is known for. Certainly, when it is experienced in its full magnanimity. From the Absolute's point of view, it is just that. The subject gets hidden in the objective sphere of experience only to regain its status again, and the reverse view is the object reintegrated into pure subjectivity by the light illuminating objective experience in the first place. The local human perspective, however, is not as simple nor as linear. Giving it a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't always work, because every one of us is experiencing these dynamics in such a uniquely intimate way that it renders mini-maps useless when it comes to being plunged head to toe, as it were, into the uncharted waters most true awakenings are known for. With that said, no matter how diverse or dramatic one's process is, or how much one is being tossed on the sea of consciousness, one would be wise to hold on to the self. Even when going through the phases of the dissolution of what we experience as this corporeal reality of the body-mind, that I, that single eye of awareness, pun intended, I, as that singularity of vision in all our experiences, is what safeguards the journey in all its phases, simply because that I is all there is. Every experience, no matter how profound, subtle, or otherworldly, is always in reference to that which is being spoken here in terms of the direct experience with reference to one's own subjectivity. In Kashmir Shaivism, the significance of this singularity is expressed in the supreme mantra, Aham, or I am. The Aham is considered to be the alpha and omega of all mantras. The phonemes of the mantra are phonemes, I think is how you say that, of the mantra are perfectly expressed in the triad Ah, as that open sound of a vowel, which stands for pure awareness, as Shiva. Ha expresses the reflective power of awareness as Śakti, and as that reverberating sonorous sound, as the resonance that is left after striking an enormous bell, corresponds to the individual as Nara and the universe. An individual and the universe are identical in that they are indistinguishable and mutually supporting realities. The entire universe exists in the mind, just as the mind is an expression of the universe. Thus, the relationship in that triadic dynamic is an expression of the supreme mantra, Aham. Phonetically, the mantra contains in itself Shiva, Śakti, and individual existence. It contains in itself the entirety of all that there is. The transcendent, the beyond, and the immanent are all encapsulated in that mantra. Whereas the triadic relationship of will, knowledge, and action is the expressive potentiality of aham. Tantric Śaivism assigns tremendous importance to the mantra, for it's considered to be the manifestation of the creation of Shiva as Shiva himself. For that reason, aham is often spoken of as the heart, hard, or hridaya, the supreme expression of Shiva's essence. We shall expound this in later chapters, what that entails, and why this view differs from other perspectives where the physicality of the world may even have a different feel to it, a different understanding. From the point of view of this non-dual Shaivism, the physicality of the world is nothing other than the body of Shiva. 3 phases of manifestation. The concept of manifestation in Tantric Śaivism is inseparable from total and unimpeded freedom, svatantraya, of the absolute, anuttara, in its sovereignty as pure light and ultimate reality, to express itself as creation, sustenance, absorption, and concealment of its own essence, and as the self-revealing power of grace, altogether popularly known as the 5 divine actions of Shiva. The Shaivite philosophy operates with the 36 tattvas comprising the entirety of manifestation from Shiva to Prithvi, earth, that is, from the pure categories down to the elemental order of the diversified universe. For our purposes, we shall focus on the process of manifestation from the point of view of universal emission in its relation to the 3 aspects of Kuņdalinī, and as expounded by Abhinavagupta in his Tantra Loka. To have access to the intricacy of the process in terms of how manifestation is viewed in the respective tradition, we bring the following new terms: kula, or kaula, which translates as family, a group which forms a unit. It could also be in relation to sounds as letters, a group of vowels and consonants, to which Kashmir Shaivism gives tremendous importance because it sees the manifestation as a progressive expression of sound, and more specifically as divine speech, vach, not dissimilar to the concept of logos. The 50 letters of the Sanskrit alphabet are considered to be the display of the energies of Shiva and Śakti, with the vowels and consonants forming the matrix of existence. The kula, or kaula, is a group of certain energies, a group of deities coming together to rise as manifestation. The opposite of that is represented by the term akula, literally beyond kula, beyond manifestation, beyond appearance, beyond coming together. The significance of this is apparent, for it could be said that manifestation is held at the juncture point with the assistance of this group of energies, these deities that come together in that truly cosmic, Shakespearean, to be or not to be dilemma. Furthermore, in relation to the activity of Kuņdalinī, when Śakti makes that move towards manifestation, Shiva's nature is hidden. In other words, when the group, kaula, of energies come forth to manifest, Shiva's essence as pure awareness is obscured. It falls on the background, as it were. When, on the other hand, the propensity to remain merged with Shiva outweighs the coming together of the energies of manifestation, Śakti remains reabsorbed and indistinguishable from the absolute reality of Shiva. Supreme consciousness in its aspect as kula, a group of unifying principles as various energies, is the cause of this universe when it arises or withdraws. When it is free of the energies of Shiva, it is known as anuttara, the undifferentiated absolute reality. But swelled with desire to manifest the universe, it displays its absolute freedom, svatantriya, by giving rise to the essence of Shiva Śakti. Conversely, Shiva as akula, beyond the group of deities, embedded with luminosity, emits his own energy of self-awareness as that aforementioned prakasa and vimarsa, luminosity and the power to reflect its own light. Thus, the emission proceeds with Shiva's energy of self-awareness, vimarsa, in this instance known as kauliki, in the respective tradition. That subtle energy of Kundalini joins with Shiva and in mutual delight rises, taking the form of energies of will, knowledge, and action. The merging of Shiva Shakti is the energy of bliss, Ananda Shakti, and the unifying friction between produces vibration, a blissful energy of universal flow. Kauliki is that impulse giving impetus for emission, whilst remaining one with supreme awareness. Frothing with exuberance, she is at once containing the transcendent and the immanent. She is the reality of perfect equilibrium beyond Para, supreme, and Aparā, non-supreme, containing the entire universe from pure transcendence to the outer sphere of activity. She is therefore known as the goddess who carries the name of Kauliki, the emission of absolute awareness. Kauliki is both Kula and Akula, encompassing in herself the sum total of all phases of creation beyond any divisions, containing it all in her plenitude. Emission, Visarga, is the point of origination and of a final reabsorption as an expression of creative potentiality of Shiva, unifying friction of Shiva and his power. As an expression of creative potentiality of Shiva and Shakti as an act in itself. Creative emission takes place through a double movement, the unifying friction of Shiva and his power. At a human level, this is reflected in the churning produced by inhaled and exhaled breaths within the median pathway of subtle energy, Susumna Nadi, as well as in sexual union. This oscillation creates tremendous energy flowing as the virile potency of manifestation, and that very same force is what gives Kundalini the power to ascend at the level of human experience. We will now view the manifestation process in relation to the three aspects of Kundalini as an expression of the triple emission of Shiva, defined in the respective Tantra as the supreme, the intermediate, and the lower, which are in strict correlation to Trika's exegesis on the threefold nature of the Absolute as Parā, Parā-Aparā, and Upāyas. These in turn correspond to the three aspects known as Para Kundalini, Sit Kundalini or Shakti Kundalini, and Prana Kundalini. Supreme emission is an expression of Para Kundalini as Anuttara, an indescribable state of undifferentiated supreme awareness, where there is no distinction between Shiva in his power as it emits and reabsorbs manifestation in its fullness, and the indescribable vibrancy as Prakasa, luminosity. According to various sources, including the Vijnana Bhairava, Malinvijayavartika, and Tantraloka, the emission is considered supreme when it is the full and ravishing unfoldment of absolute reality, out of its own perfect freedom as the self in its inner and outer aspects. Intermediate emission is comparable to a point of extremely delicate balance, characterized as both supreme and non-supreme. It is Kundalini as consciousness, hence the term Shakti Kundalini, synonymously Chit Kundalini or CIT, Sit, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. She is the power of self-awareness in her emitting aspect as Vimarsa, reflection. In her aspect as consciousness, just before proceeding towards emission, pure quiescent energy begins to stir, but since not turned outward yet, rests within himself as consciousness free from any outpouring or emitting flow. There is some stirring, but still immersed in undivided plenitude. The objective energy is inseparable from the subjective one. Now, to grasp what happens next, we need to bring back the concept of Bindu as that dot, concentrated point of energy, drop of light, representing perfect equilibrium of Shiva Shakti prior to any manifestation, in its relation to Visarga as that creative emission. Bindu stands for pure awareness, for Shiva as Akula, graphically represented by a single dot, and phonetically by the all-encompassing Aham. Visarga, on the other hand, is represented by two dots as the split of Bindu into the dyadic aspect of Shiva and Shakti. The concept is succinctly elaborated in the following quote from Kshamaraja in his commentaries on Shiva Sutras. This is 11.7, translated by Jadeva Singh. Then the supreme I consciousness expresses the undivided knowledge of the universe in the form of a dot, bindu, in the letter Am. It shows further the Visarga stage in the form of two perpendicular dots, indicating simultaneously inner and outer manifestation. This represents the scintillating throb within bindu, which gives rise to the 2 points of the emission. In Śakti Kuņdalinī, these 2 points are in perfect equilibrium, yet as soon as there is any movement towards dominance of one over another point, an imperceptible tendency to manifest rises there and then. It's as if Kuņdalinī in this stage is holding it all at the finest point of balance, whether to remain in her state of undifferentiated awareness or to burst forth in her outward movement and cause the universe to rise. If Śakti makes the move towards manifestation, Shiva remains hidden. If she reabsorbs manifestation, Shiva is shining in all his glory. Śakti Kuņdalinī acts as an intermediary between the two Kuņdalinī. If she turns inward, she merges into Shiva and regains her essence as pure consciousness and supreme Parā-Kuņdalinī. And if prompted by self-generated propensity, she is turned outward and begins to stir creation into being, she is moved to a lower stage of emission and becomes the energy of vital breath known as Prāṇa-Kuṇdalinī. From there on, the emission is getting denser and the breath becomes an expression of Prāṇa-Kuṇdalinī in her manifestation as mantra Hamsa or Hamsa, swan, which is said to be recited by every individual even if unaware of the mantra's meaning as I am that. For that reason, the mantra is known as ajapa japa, non-reciting recitation. The sound ha represents Śakti. The nasal sound stands for an individual awareness, and sa represents Shiva. The mantra of natural breath thus encompasses the threefold essence of Shiva, Śakti, Nara, and is known as Trika mantra. Hamsa represents breath as the outer movement towards manifestation and is complemented by its reflection as mantra Saham, which is the reverse of that process, indicating its movement towards absorption. The following verse from the Vijnana Bhairavī Tantra gives illuminating insight into the way the awareness of one's breath is turned into highest spiritual practice. Quote, verse 155, translated by Jadeva Singh. In that great goddess, there is the great joy of the conjunction of sa and ha, i.e. the mantra soham, which is like a yajna or sacrifice of vimarsa or I consciousness. Pursuing it and resting in it, i.e. the joy of the mantra, one becomes identified with the great goddess and thus, through her, one attains to Bhairavī. Lower emission is an expression of Prāṇa-Kuṇdalinī as the energy of vital breath paves the way for emanation from which all levels of reality emerge as those categories, tattvas of manifestation. Still indescribably supple, she is a primordial quiver of objective manifestation, carrying within itself a mere tendency to externalize her subtle nature. Now, consciousness transforms itself into vital breath, and even though remaining in its essence as innermost reality and the substratum of everything in manifestation, awareness conceals its essence by imposing limitations on all its 5 divine qualities, by applying coverings, kankukas, at the phase of manifestation known as Maya, and from there on keeps on projecting itself outward to the uttermost point represented by the bindu, at the opposite pole of the source of it all, unfolding itself into prana, where she finds her repose. To quote a famous aphorism by another Kashmiri sage, Kalada, the life generated by vital breath is the first modification of consciousness. Turning itself into vital energy of breath in her descent, Prāṇa-Kuṇdalinī rests at the stages of creative manifestation and rushes down, following the thousands of channels. What goes into making the subtle body, creating an intricate network of infinitesimally subtle pathways of energy. assuming the aspect of the central or middle pathway, Susumna Nadi, and taking the breath energy for its support, she descends from the crown of the head to the base of the spine, to the lower opening where, now fully as energy of breath, she coils herself into slumber. And yet, the energy of subtle breath freely moves in the central nadi, from where all actions spring forth and into which everything subsides. Here, in the void of Susumna, the breath maps out the path of manifestation and also the return to its source. This is the aspect of Kuņdalinī which moves towards manifestation and assumes the form of this world, as we know it, through the vehicle of prana, manifesting itself as breath in the body. And therefore it is known as the lower emission. To experience Prāņa Kuņdalinī in her essence as the goddess of self-transformation is to go through the stages of internalization. For just as Śakti Kuņdalinī gives rise to Prāņa Kuņdalinī in her desire for outward movement, in the same way the awakening of Kuņdalinī is a reversal of that movement. In her return, after having assumed the form of Prāņa Kuņdalinī, the formless state of Śakti Kuņdalinī, the goddess, regains her plenitude in her aspect of Purnahanta, where all aspects of Shiva Shakti are united, and the emitting powers are infused with pure transcendence, known as triple Visarga, the union of threefold aspects. The goddess now abides in the supreme energy of Parā Kuņdalinī. From emergence, bringing forth manifestation to its consequent return, for Shiva to reveal himself beyond transcendence and immanence, Kuņdalinī as his Shakti is reversed in the Kula Kuņdalinī system as the origin, the substance, and the ultimate dissolution of it all. When it comes to the importance of Kuņdalinī as the power behind transformation of human consciousness, we cannot be certain at what point the term gained an ambiguity to the degree that the process became marginalized or even dismissed by certain proponents of the talking school, including the so-called reference to direct path, popularized in non-dual circles with its exclusive focus on intellectual grasp, believed to be sufficient for self-recognition, as it is referred to in spiritual circles. We have alluded to the potential source of these biases in the introduction to this volume, which are one way or another rooted in Kuņdalinī being viewed as a symbol vis-a-vis as a process, and more specifically the distinction between pranatana, activation of pranic currents, and the true rising of Kuņdalinī. This would be given a detailed overview in the coming chapters. 4 means, the Upāyas. In the light of the Tantras, Tantra Loka, Abhinavagupta speaks of the principal paths to self-realization, dividing all practices and known approaches into 4 categories, which he defines as the fourfold knowledge. While the Shiva Sutras already outline a triadic structure of means, Sambhavupāya, Shaktapāya, and Anavopāya, as reflected in the division of its 3 chapters, Abhinavagupta extends and deepens this classical triad into a fourfold system. He includes Anupāya, the no means, as the ultimate consummation where all other means dissolve in pure recognition. In his hands, what had been a loosely articulated set of teachings scattered across earlier sources is gathered into a single luminous structure of ascent. These 4 pathways represent the totality of possible approaches to liberate that emerged over centuries of spiritual inquiry in the Indian subcontinent. Yet it is in Abhinavagupta's synthesis that they find their fullest expression. Drawing from his own direct realization and from the vast corpus of Shaiva doctrine, he offers not only a classification of methods, but a vision of how consciousness returns to itself through its own powers. His exposition confers upon these paths their definitive articulation and enduring authority within the Trika Shiva tradition. I'm so sorry. No means no. The highest is known as Anupāya, literally no means. It is where all means culminate in direct recognition of one's own essence as uninterrupted awareness, beyond succession and non-succession, free of causality or modes of perception. fully exemplifying the pathless path. Upāya corresponds to the absolute, anuttara, that reality beyond all traces of subjectivity and objectivity, beyond transcendence and immanence, and beyond any conceivable process of experience. It is empowered by ananda, bliss, in its mode as pure awareness. There is no discipline that can lead to this self-evident truth of abiding as one's own self, free of every dichotomy. Upāya is fullness and liberation itself. There is nothing that can be added to, nor subtracted from, who we are in our essence. Nothing can bring us closer to that essence, nor can anything take us further from the light that we are. The realization that nothing can be done to become who one already is marks this highest state. It is the recognition that everything depends upon consciousness, including all forms of practice, external or internal. Therefore, there are no means to realize what already illumines everything, within and without. This supreme state, though homogeneous in principle, for consciousness is one, admits degrees in how it is realized. There are rare beings who are born established in that recognition, whose very presence becomes a means of liberation for others, or who, through their direct experience, enrich the traditions they inhabit. Others reach that state through unwavering resolve and painstaking preparation until Upāya becomes their natural condition. Though it calls forth the sum of one's resources, the realization itself is often sudden and irreversible when accompanied by the fullness it represents. In the continuum of uninterrupted awareness, the energies of will, knowledge, and action are fused into the bliss of one's own self. This type of realization is articulated most clearly in the doctrine of recognition, Pratyabhijna Hridayam, expounded by Samananda and greatly favored by Abhinavagupta, who regarded it as the ultimate revelation of one's essence as Shiva. Yet in keeping with Trika's non-dual inclusivity, Upāya may also be discerned within other systems, within the doctrine of vibration, Spanda, and even within the sequential approach of the Krama tradition. The unidentifiable mode of experience represented by Upāya cannot be regarded as a quantifiable path in any pragmatic sense. It is a metaphysical category, an expression of absolute freedom. In that fully liberated state, one is said to experience everything as the nectar of one's own innate bliss. Upāya, though sometimes the fruit of practice, is itself beyond practice. One established therein no longer perceives diversity as other, for everything is suffused with the light of one's own self. This state is ineffable, beyond anything in the manifested order, even when spoken of through the highest levels of emission represented by the pure categories, the tattvas of manifestation. Immediately below the level of Upāya stands the highest of the three applicable means, the divine means, Sambhogopāya. This is the path of Shiva, characterized by the emergence of a subtle distinction between goal and path, held in perfect equilibrium by pure subjectivity. The divine means. The divine means, or Sambhogopāya, is regarded as the supreme path to self-realization. It corresponds to Shiva in a state of perfect unity prior to any emergence of objectivity, where all phenomena remain enfolded within the subjective sphere of universal aham, the I consciousness. It is therefore the expression of the eternal subject, the experience of unity before the slightest ripple of differentiation. The operating power of Sambhogopāya is will, Icha Śakti, and its hallmark is the absence of mental activity, an immediate, non-conceptual grasp of reality that knows without succession, without mediation. Perception here is not constructed through thought, but arises as pure recognition, untainted and whole. The mantra aham, I am, is its central pivot. As an expression of the goddess, aham embodies the power of Shiva, Śakti, and their condensation into the individual self. It is both declaration and revelation. the pulse of being echoing through every perceiver. The one who moves within this highest means must be able to arrest perception at its very inception. Just as awareness turns outward toward the object, and instead of being drawn into the sensations that follow, instantly return to its own source in I consciousness. When this is mastered, the object is perceived in its essence, luminous and unsoiled by mental constructs. Abhinavagupta repeatedly emphasizes this immediacy of perception beyond conceptualization as he writes in Tantra Loka, I 246 through 247, translated by Dykskowski in the Doctrine of Vibration, page 103. That which shines and is directly grasped in the first moment of perception while it is still free of differentiated representations and reflects upon itself is the basis of the divine means, said to be the will. Just as an object appears directly to one whose eyes are open without the intervention of any mental cogitation, so, for some, does Shiva's nature. To practice Sambhavopāya presupposes a highly refined consciousness, a mind trained to dissolve thought at will. The preparatory discipline for this level is cultivated through the two lower means, which temper and attune awareness until thought loses its habitual dominance. At this point, the practitioner no longer depends on structured meditative absorption, but rests in spontaneous recognition, capable of seizing the impulse of will before it descends into the objectifying current of experience. This can occur anywhere, at any time, even with eyes open. For this is the path wherein Shiva's grace alone awakens consciousness to itself, uniting the practitioner with the supreme awareness that is his own. The aim of this divine means is the fusion of the triad, subject, instrument of knowledge, and object, so that the three are carried into manifestation as one continuum. When practiced seamlessly, the three are fused into the unified powers of will, knowledge, and action, the Trisula of Shiva, emblem of sovereignty and unimpeded freedom. Sambhavopāya is thus the way of supreme infusion, the path of undifferentiated awareness wherein pure consciousness, Shiva, is inseparable from its power of reflection, Śakti. It is rightly called the path of Shiva, the superior means of realization. One might also say that Sambhavopāya, as the unitive means of Shiva Śakti, is the living expression of Parā-Kundalini, the supreme current of consciousness in her plenitude, sometimes called Purna Kundalini for that very reason, as it is fullness itself. The empowered means. The empowered means, or Shaktopāya, belongs to the inner domain, where all practice is directed toward gathering the dispersed energies of thought back into the heart of pure consciousness. Empowered by Jnana Shakti, the energy of knowledge, this Upāya unfolds as the recognition of unity within diversity. Its mode of perception is synthetic, simultaneously successive and non-successive, weaving together the rhythm of movement and stillness in a single continuum. Applying the empowered means requires one-pointedness, ekagrata, described in exquisite detail in the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra as the art of centering. One is to maintain steady attention in the intervals between inhalation and exhalation, between two thoughts, between perception and its recognition, between any two actions. It is in these infinitesimal pauses that awareness can be gathered and reabsorbed into its own source. Practice here consists of holding fast to the subtle thread of uninterrupted awareness that strings together every cycle of perception and activity, allowing all the energies that empower the senses and mind to merge back into the full pulse of universal consciousness. To recognize that these diversified powers are none other than the play of one's own awareness. To perceive them as particular pulsations vibrating in harmony with the universal rhythm is the very essence of Shaktopāya. To enter the empowered means is to immerse oneself consciously in the field of Śakti, to realize one's identity with Shiva, the sole possessor of these countless powers. As in the divine means, one plunges into non-differentiated awareness, but here the movement is gradual, wave by wave, rather than instantaneous. The key distinction from Upāyas lies in the timing of perception. When the practitioner fails to seize the first instant before cognition arises, the pure flash of aham prior to any conceptual elaboration, one descends to the level of Śaktipāya. Here, the work is to deal skillfully with the aftermath of that descent, the projection of a subject into an objective sphere where experience solidifies into mental image and representation. The task is to intercept this process before the subject-object polarity crystallizes into vikalpa, a thought construct that fragments the seamless unity of reality. The thought process itself rests upon the duality of subject and object, whereby consciousness, pulled outward, forgets its plenitude and identifies with the limited mind. The aim is to rescue subjectivity from entanglement in its own projections. Hence, the cultivation of thought-free awareness, not as suppression of mind, but as its purification, restoring to it the capacity to reflect consciousness as a mirror once polished of dust. For the greater the dependence on the thought process, the dimmer the awareness. For the greater the dependence on the thought process, the dimmer the awareness. Conversely, the quieting of thought reveals consciousness in increasing brilliance. Though certain perspectives have condemned the mind as the thief of awareness, Tantric Śaivism affirms that the mind too is a ray of the same invisible light. Nothing can veil or obstruct consciousness, for even obscuration is but its own self-modulation. All mental activities are rays emitted by the one reality, consciousness, chit, shining as all things. I believe that's how you say that, C-I-T, I don't know. It is consciousness as vimarsa, self-reflective awareness, that perceives everything by recognizing itself in the myriad forms it assumes. The individual does not, strictly speaking, perceive an external world. Rather, consciousness experiences itself as an individual through that very act of cognition. What we call gnosis, jnana, is simply this reversal, the knowing of the knower by the knower. The individual is thus an experience in consciousness, a role consciousness plays for the delight of recognizing itself. I have to read that again, oh my God. It is consciousness as vimarsa, self-reflective awareness, that perceives everything by reorganizing itself in the myriad forms it assumes. The individual does not, strictly speaking, perceive an external world. Rather, consciousness experiences itself as an individual through that very act of cognition. What we call gnosis, jnana, is simply this reversal, the knowing of the knower by the knower. The individual is thus an experience in consciousness, a role consciousness plays for the delight of recognizing itself. Even in modern terms such as metacognition or in altered states of awareness, it is this same reflexive movement of consciousness, the light turning upon itself, that creates the theater of cognition. The seer, the seeing, and the seen are all illumined by the same awareness. Experience itself is made of this triad, unified in essence through appearing divided. The reality of this unity dawns only when the differentiating energies dissolve back into the light of consciousness. The purpose of practice, therefore, is not to arrest thought, but to free it from the tyranny of vikalpa, the overlays of conditioning, impressions and belief that cloud cognition. Like rust on the mirror of awareness, they obscure the true reflection of the self. As the Tantric and Sufi metaphors alike suggest, the work is to polish the mirror until it reveals one's original face. The aim is to remove doubt about one's essence, samsaya, the poison of the mind, so that the heart stands transparent once again. In Sambhava-Upāya, the emphasis is on the I am, that which precedes all perception and cognition, exemplified by the supreme mantra Aham, the symbol of pure subjectivity. In Shaktopāya, the emphasis shifts to you, the field of manifestation, the dynamic expression of awareness as the power of knowledge and relation. It is Śakti herself who bridges subject and object, maintaining the pulsation of duality while revealing its underlying unity. Here, the movement of consciousness mirrors the very play of Kuņdalinī. Outward as emission, Visarga in the form of Prāņa Kuņdalinī, and inward as the return to undifferentiated awareness, Parā-Kuņdalinī. Thus, Shaktopāya is often called the intermediate means, Parā-Aparā, the supreme non-supreme. It is the field where consciousness displays both the luminous subject and its myriad reflections as object, where you still contains the I. To recognize that the rays of multiplicity are one with the source of light is to be established in Shaktopāya. The essential practice, therefore, is to center awareness in the interval, between thoughts, between actions, between breaths. It is the path of discernment, the path of knowledge, demanding great velocity of awareness. Velocity here means not haste, but vibrancy, the awakened life force of Śakti moving unobstructed through the field of consciousness. Should awareness slacken, one falls from Shaktopāya into a lower mode of practice. Continuity is the key, an unbroken current of awareness through every activity. To sustain this continuity is to see reality unveiled between every thought and act, shining as the light of one's own awareness that unites seer and seen. For Shaktopāya to succeed, one must maintain one-pointedness at the center of every pair of movements, mental or physical. This same one-pointedness, ekagrata, is also a prerequisite for the steady ascent of Kuņdalinī. When doubt arises about one's essence, when awareness breaks into sequence or loses its coherence, the current of Śakti becomes disrupted and the practitioner must descend into the Anavopāya, the individual means, to regain balance and strength. The individual means. Known as Anavopāya, the individual means concern the individualized sphere of consciousness. Metaphysically, these means represent the individual soul, Nara or Anu, in its striving toward the lost sense of wholeness. Empowered by Kriya Shakti, the force of action, this is an experience of diversity in its fullest measure. The mode of perception in Anavopāya is analytical and sequential, characterized by progressive stages of experience within the field of manifestation. These means belong to the outer realm of practice and therefore consist of a full spectrum of externalized disciplines aimed at purifying thought so that the mind regains its natural capacity to reflect the light of consciousness. Tantric literature offers a vast range of such methods, the most comprehensive being the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, which enumerates 112 yogas. These include meditations, contemplations, centering techniques, visualizations, regulation of vital breath, pranayama, bodily postures, asana, gestures and attitudes, mudra, and the use of physical supports, all serving to assist the transformation of individual consciousness into universal awareness. Though external in form, the goal here is the same as in the higher Upāyas, to heal the rupture born of the subject-object division and to transcend the mind's tendencies until vikalpas no longer obscure the direct, unperturbed cognition of one's essence. Regaining the mind's reflective transparency makes one fit for the higher means, most often through the intermediate Shaktopāya, or at times directly through the Sambhavapāya. Although the Upāyas are spoken of hierarchically, from the superior to the intermediate to the inferior, this does not diminish the value or efficacy of the lower means. There exists an organic correlation among them, for one naturally fluctuates between levels depending on the degree of one's establishment in the higher means or the success of one's application in practice. This fluidity gives rise to subcategories and interlaced combinations of means. As Abhinavagupta notes, when new combinations are required to meet a practitioner's evolving state, the means multiply. 3 become 6, 6 become 12, and 12, 24, each reflecting a finer articulation of consciousness's descent and return. Distinguished by the operative powers of awareness as will, Icha Shakti, knowledge, Jnana Shakti, and action, Kriya Shakti, these are not regarded as 3 separate forces, but 3 modalities of the same consciousness, Shakti unfolding herself through gradations of refinement. In Anavopaya, it is Kriya Shakti, the power of action, that predominates. Yet even here, the power at work is not mechanical effort, but consciousness itself laboring to rediscover its own center within embodiment. Anavopaya thus encompasses the full spectrum of practices devoted to harnessing and sanctifying the sensory, physiological, and psychological faculties, the Karmendriyas and Jnanendriyas as instruments of awakening. Body, speech, and mind are consecrated as vehicles of recognition rather than obstacles to transcendence. One learns to act, breathe, and perceive in rhythm with the sacred pulse of prana, allowing every gesture and thought to mirror the heartbeat of the Absolute. Abhinavagupta makes clear that even the most outward ritual, an oblation, a mantra recitation, a steady gaze upon a sacred symbol, becomes, when rightly understood, an enactment of the universal process of emanation and return. Srishti Samhara, the individual act is never merely individual. It is Shakti remembering herself through the microcosmic theater of the practitioner. Hence, the so-called lower means are not inferior in essence, but only in immediacy. The degree to which recognition, pratyabhijna, flashes forth unmediated. When action ceases to be propelled by the sense of an actor, Anavopaya naturally flowers into Shaktopaya, and from there into Sambhavopaya. In this sense, the individual means are the compassionate entryway through which Shiva gathers back his own scattered rays. They are the bridge for those whose awareness is dispersed in multiplicity, allowing consciousness to become aware of its own bondage by using the very instruments of bondage as means of release. The body becomes a yantra, the breath a mantra, the world itself a field of practice. When every act, no matter how mundane, is suffused with awareness, the division between spiritual and worldly dissolves. Thus, Anavopaya represents both the point of entry and the abiding foundation of all other means. It honors embodiment as the indispensable ground of transformation, where the finite opens upon the infinite, and the pulse of Kuņdalinī begins her measured ascent. Even the subtlest recognitions of Sambhavopaya must ultimately find their expression through this plane of action, through purified instruments of perception and awakened rhythms of life. In this way, the circle is complete. The so-called individual means, when perfected, reveal themselves not as the lowest rung, but as Shiva's own play in descent. The descent that alone makes return possible. Anavopaya is thus the art of transmuting limitation into offering, motion into stillness, and effort into grace. It is Shakti as Kriya, the pulse of Kuņdalinī herself, reabsorbing the multiplicity of acts into the indivisible heart of awareness. In the chapters that follow, we turn from the structure of means to the living dynamics through which they unfold. Having glimpsed the pathways of awareness, divine, empowered, and individual, we now descend into their field of operation, the breath, the currents of prana, and the subtle body as Kuņdalinī's own instrument. For it is there, within the pulsation of life itself, that these means cease to be theory and become the alchemy of direct transformation. Chapter 2, Hidden in Plain Sight. think it's 335. Let me just see. We can go to, maybe. Yeah, let's try this. Okay, importance of breath and subtle anatomy. We have established that Kuņdalinī, in her form as Prāņa Śakti, expresses herself as breath. That is why breath in so many spiritual traditions is regarded as the very manifestation of spirit in the body. This understanding is present in Taoism, Kabbalah, in Sufi mysticism, and numerous other currents where breath is more than physiology. It is pneuma, ruah, ru, chi. Across cultures, the same intuition surfaces. Breath is the subtlest gesture of the divine in form, the intimacy of consciousness animating flesh. Breath sets every process in motion, yet what is commonly understood as respiration is only one layer of its mystery. There is a subtler breath, threading through unseen pathways. Breath in the body is the face of God, exclaimed a Sufi poet. In Persian, Ru signifies both soul and breath, exemplifying this unity. God, as breath in the body, is not an idea, but a manifestation in motion. The Tantric tradition makes the same point with its own precision. Through the lens of the three forms of the goddess, it is Prāņa Kuņdalinī who descends and assumes what we experience as the breath that sustains the body. This breath is not mere air. It is the living activity of consciousness diversifying itself into currents. Every gesture, from the subtlest intuition to the most exerting physical movement, is inseparable from prana. The tradition speaks of 100 foremost currents, narrowing those down to 40, then finally distilling them to 10, and among these, 5 are deemed principal: prana, apana, vyana, samyana, and uddiyana. To outline briefly, prana and apana are the primal movements upward and downward. Inhalation, paradoxically, is governed by apana, for the breath descends. Exhalation is ruled by prana, as it rises and expels. These two set the stage for all the others. Samana, seated in the navel, digests and assimilates, not only food, but experience itself, hence the old insight linking belly and mind. Vyana pervades the whole body, binding its parts into coherence, and udana, from ud, to rise, moves upward from the solar plexus through the throat and governs expression. One with a strong udana speaks with clarity, moves with creativity. Their voice itself carries the current of Śakti. These are not abstractions. They represent somatic realities perceptible as one deepens in practice. The skilled yogin comes to discern the play of pranas as one discerns the moods of a familiar friend. Among the countless nadis or subtle channels, 3 are held as principal: Ida, Pingala, and Susamna. The first 2, lunar and solar, govern the oscillating rhythms of life, linked to left and right nostrils, right and left brain hemispheres, cooling and heating, sympathetic and parasympathetic flows. In ordinary life, breath shifts ceaselessly between these 2. Yet, and this is crucial, they never flow together. When one nostril is open, the other is closed, even if ever so slightly. This is not congestion, but a deeper law of alternation. But in the narrow interval between these shifts, breath enters susumna. For a moment, polarity subsides, both nostrils open, both hemispheres rest. Sympathetic and parasympathetic are suspended in equipoise. This pause is brief, yet it is a doorway. Here, the yogin tastes stillness unprovoked, a natural samadhi offered by the body itself. One slips inward as if carried. This moment cannot be forced or engineered. Certain traditions devise ways to lengthen it, yet Tantra holds it as a spontaneous grace, designed into embodiment in self. Several times each day, this gift is offered, a repose hidden in plain sight. It is the breath through susamna. The Shaiva masters call this madhya, the middle, the threshold. In the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, verses 24 through 29, the goddess is instructed to rest awareness precisely in the interval between inhalation and exhalation, for there the supreme reality flashes forth. Abhinavagupta, commenting in the Tantra Loka, verses 105 to 106, affirms that the Madhya is not confined to the breath alone, but appears in every transition between thoughts, between perceptions, between waking and sleep. Recognition, pratyabhijna, dawns in these liminal moments, when awareness has not yet fixed on an object, nor dissolved into absence. We shall explore this later on in the book. In Vedic and Tantric ritual, this logic is mirrored in the Sandhya, the twilight junctures of dawn and dusk, where transition itself is sanctified. Breath in Sushumna is the inner twilight, the bodily analog of those cosmic thresholds. As Andrei Padu, one of the foremost interpreters of Tantric metaphysics and ritual language, in his seminal work, Vach, the concept of the word in selected Hindu tantras, reminds us that breath and sound alike point to Shakti's pulsation. Every utterance is born of silence, sustained in vibration, and returns again into silence. In the same way, the breath through Sushumna is not only physiological, but in essence vibrational. Śakti revealing her ground in the pause between movements. Alexis Sanderson, perhaps the most rigorous living authority on Shaiva Tantra, has shown through his studies of Trika ritual that liminality is ritually foregrounded as the privileged site of transformation. Here, within embodiment itself, Sushumna is that site, a natural initiation where dualities recede and recognition stands unveiled. Why speak of it as a state of mind? Because breath and mind are bound together as two fish in the same pond. To alter one is to stir the other. In Tantric philosophy, this is an axiom. Prana and Chitta are both modulations of Shakti, inseparable movements of the same power. Thus, whenever breath flows through Sushumna, savor it. Even in mundane activity, one feels the shift, an inner release, a sigh of balance. In its most natural and physiological sense, this flow corresponds to the spontaneous harmonization of the autonomic rhythms, the lunar and solar channels, Ida and Pingala, momentarily fall into balance, and their altering currents meeting in the central stream. Modern physiology recognizes this as a natural alternation of dominance between the nostrils occurring roughly every hour, a subtle oscillation that mirrors the deeper dance of life's polar forces. In the narrow intervals between these shifts, the breath passes through the Sushumna as a brief, natural act of grace. It is a microcosmic reflection of equilibrium, where the dual currents of the body resolve into stillness, and the mind too finds rest in its own source. Yet the expression breath of Sushumna also operates in a deeper plane. Beyond these fleeting physiological moments, it points to a cultivated state that can be consciously sustained through dedicated yogic discipline, through pranayama, meditation, and, above all, through the refinement of awareness itself. The practitioner learns to steady this inner balance until the central current becomes a living conduit of the goddess. What at first occurs as a transient physiological rhythm matures into an unbroken interior alignment, where the breath no longer oscillates between opposites, but rises and falls within the same axis of stillness. Here, the yogin's very respiration is infused with awareness. Each inhalation an ascent into luminosity, each exhalation a descent into repose. When we speak, therefore, of the breath in Sushumna, physiology and metaphysics are intertwined. The outer breath reflects the inner current of consciousness. To be established in Sushumna is not merely to master a technique of breath control, but to abide in the madhya, the middle, the point of perfect equilibrium, where awareness rests in its own pulsation, spanda. In the language of Tantric Śaivism, this state corresponds to the recognition pratyabhijna of one's identity with the heart of Shiva, where the polarities of Ichya, will, jnana, knowledge, and kriya, action, are fused into the still dynamism of pure awareness. In this sense, the fleeting equipoise of breath exemplifies more than a curiosity. It is the encoded promise of the entire Kuņdalinī arc. What begins as a momentary physiological balance is nothing less than a seed form of awakening, a foretaste of the current that, when fully aroused, will traverse the Susumna in its sovereign ascent. The body rehearses countless times a day the pattern of its own illumination, breath rising and returning through the central channel, mirroring the eternal inhalation and exhalation of the cosmos itself. It is a glimpse given daily of what will later be explored on these pages in greater depth, the central mystery of how Kuņdalinī moves through the subtle body and transforms the field of embodiment. Concept of Kuņdalinī in other cultures and spiritual traditions. The point of origination. Kuņdalinī as consciousness. The concept of Kuņdalinī, though intimately tied to the cultural and spiritual heritage of India, is by no means exclusive to it. Analogous expressions of this mysterious force, this innate power of transformation, can be found across many, if not all, of the world's spiritual traditions. In some, the reference is veiled by metaphor and encoded in esoteric language, requiring the eyes of a scholar or the intuition of a mystic to discern what is being spoken of. The question then arises, who holds the authority to interpret such texts? The custodians of established religions, each claiming their scriptures to be based on revealed truth, may nonetheless shape that truth through layers of interpretation, translation, and institutional emphasis. What becomes the accepted body of spiritual knowledge is inevitably shaped and mediated by the uniqueness of a given culture and a time. The times we live in are characterized by an unprecedented cross-pollination of ideas between traditions, a process that, while present in antiquity, proceeded at a far slower pace. Today, ancient doctrines can be compared side by side across continents. With this acceleration comes a certain flattening of the intricacies that constitute the richness of a given tradition, and teachings that were once protected by layers of initiatory rites of passage are nowadays, by and large, consumed fragmentarily in the marketplace of spiritual offerings, often in that cherry-picking manner of what feels suitable with regard to attitudes of consumer entitlement. At the same time, it's nearly impossible to distinguish between the subtle simplicity and mind-bending complexities accumulated as a result of cultural adaptation. Just as the teachings of the Buddha, which may have been exquisitely direct in essence, evolved into elaborate doctrines across Central Asia, South Asia, the Far East, and Southeast Asia, each adapting the Dharma into forms suited to their soil. So too do concepts like Kuņdalinī undergo metamorphosis as they travel through cultural membranes. Perhaps certain traditions are more explicit when it comes to the latent power. This would present an exception, and we are yet to encounter such a tradition. In Vedic and Tantric lore, the concept is always dressed in poetic metaphor, encoded in symbolism. This unapologetically hermeneutic articulation within Indic traditions has led some to assume that Kuņdalinī is a phenomenon confined to Indian metaphysics. Ironically, that very attitude has at times contributed to its marginalization in comparative spiritual studies. Thankfully, a few perceptive Western scholars and seekers sense that this phenomenon is not unique to one culture, nor should it be viewed through the narrow lens of exoticism. One of the earliest and most influential figures to bridge this understanding was Sir John Woodruff, 1865 to 1936, who published under the pen name of Arthur Avalon. His seminal work, The Serpent Power, 1918, was among the first to present tantric metaphysics, particularly Kuņdalinī Śakti and the subtle anatomy, in a rigorous and accessible form to the Western audience. Though his translation was at times colored by his own legal and philosophical background, his efforts nonetheless opened a gateway for deeper engagement with these esoteric teachings, paving the way for psychological and symbolical interpretations in the century that followed. Carl Jung, 1875 to 1961, perhaps the most well-known of these inheritors, drew extensively upon tantric imagery in his exploration of the deep psyche. In his 1932 seminar on Kuņdalinī yoga at the Psychological Club in Zurich, he likened the ascent of Kuņdalinī through the chakras to the individuation process, an inner alchemy whereby the fragmented psyche is reintegrated and transformed. Jung's attempt to reconcile Eastern metaphysical insight with Western depth psychology was not without its limitations, but it heralded a pivotal recognition that the symbolic ascent of consciousness described in tantric lore mirrors archetypal structures latent within the collective unconscious. Other thinkers followed suit. Mircea Eliade, 1907 to 1986, in Yoga, Immortality, and Freedom, in 1958, delved deeply into the transformational potential of yogic practices, recognizing Kuņdalinī as an experiential gateway between the mortal and the eternal. Heinrich Zimmer, 1890 to 1943, whose mythological approach informed the work of Joseph Campbell, also pointed to the symbolic richness of tantric cosmology and the psycho-spiritual realities it maps. Alian Danielou, 1907 and 1994, drawing from Shaiva traditions, extended this understanding further still, emphasizing the embodiment of divine intelligence within the very structure of the human being, echoing tantric assertions that man is not a fragment of the cosmos, but its very mirror. Thus, even from within the confines of cultural and disciplinary boundaries, the voice of Kuņdalinī has not gone entirely unheard. The thread remains, sometimes dim, sometimes bright, carried through the work of those willing to recognize that the body, breath, and awareness are not mere vessels or metaphors, but the very instruments in the great orchestration of awakening. Others have shown that this knowledge, or its equivalent, can be found among the Bushmen of the Kalahari, in the trance rituals of Siberian and Amazonian shamans, in the sacred rites of African tribes and First Nations peoples, and in the inner teachings of Sufism, Kabbalah, and Christian mysticism. What these all point to is not simply poetic analogy, but the direct and visceral experience of a power that lies dormant within the very core of our being, a power inseparable from awareness itself. In some cultures, this was elevated into a refined science of inner transformation. In others, it remained veiled in myth and poetic symbol. Yet wherever it appeared, it pointed toward the same essential mystery, the latent power of consciousness to return to its source, the longing of the finite to merge with the infinite. Which brings us to a fundamental inquiry. If Kuņdalinī must rise, where did she fall from? What is the origin of this movement? The very notion of ascent implies a prior descent. In other words, Kuņdalinī is not solely a dormant force to be awakened, it is a power that has deliberately descended, coiled itself into repose, and awaits reabsorption. Here, the concept of Visarga, a vital term in the metaphysical vocabulary of Tantra, comes back into view. Visarga, literally meaning emission or release, designates that primal point of origination from which all manifestation issues forth, and to which it all returns. This point of emission, Visarga, is the dynamic interface between Shiva and Śakti, between pure, undifferentiated awareness and its inherent power to manifest. In Tantric metaphysics, Visarga is the primordial friction between Shiva and his own potency, Śakti. This friction is not born of conflict, but of intimacy, a throb, a pulsation, a scintillating wave at the very heart of being. From this pulse, all arises. It is spanda, the first movement of the unmoving that gives rise to the entire tapestry of manifestation. At its most subtle, this emission is not a rupture, but a trembling at the threshold of unity, where the one shivers into the many. And just as the universe bursts forth from this primordial throb, it also finds its rest there. Visarga is not only the place of emanation, it is also the gateway of return, the aperture through which all reemerges into its origin, reemerges. On the human plane, this metaphysical principle is mirrored in the rhythm of breath, the subtle friction between inhalation and exhalation, between the incoming and outgoing current, mirrors the polarity of Shiva and Shakti, and sets in motion the entire dance of embodied awareness. Not just the breath as the intake of air through the nostrils, but breath as prana Shakti, as the vital force animating volition, at the root of all mental impulses, cognition of sense perception, and action of organs. The most striking example of this principle in human experience is found in the sexual act, wherein the creative tension of opposites gives rise to a moment of rapture, of release, and potentially of transcendence. Thus, from macrocosm to microcosm, the motif remains the same. The universe is born through this pulsation. Human beings are microcosmic expressions of its divine rhythm. When we speak of Visarga in relation to Kuņdalinī, we are speaking of the exact threshold between movement and rest, creation and dissolution, bondage and liberation. In understanding this point of emission, we begin to grasp why Kuņdalinī must rise, not as a striving upward, but as a return to the place from which she first issued forth. The movement of Kuņdalinī is not linear, it is cyclical, spiral, recursive, and at the heart of her spiral is this bindu, this Visarga, the axis where opposites converge. The nature of descent and ascent, reabsorbing the world into the self. This is the way to understand the three aspects of Kuņdalinī, para, chit, and prana, so that a greater clarity dawns as to why Kuņdalinī, spoken of as coiled within, must rise in the first place. Where is it rising? She rises, or rather reascends, in the same fashion that she once descended, and at that primordial juncture where differentiation set in. As soon as the singularity of the bindu was disturbed, original unity gave way to the triadic dynamic of experiencer, experience, and the experienced. The act of ascent is itself a mirroring of the descent, for the inward and outward movements are nothing but reciprocal currents of the same vibration. Speaking now from a more localized perspective, that is, from the vantage point of the human body, the descent of prana Kuņdalinī takes place as the downward streaming of pranic force through innumerable nadis. These subtle pathways distill into the unifying stream of Suṣumna, gathering as if tributaries pouring into the river of stillness. It is within this median channel that breath, her outermost garb, comes to rest at the base of the spine. Suṣumna is not a conduit carved into some ethereal tissue. It is a subtle current created by the very movement of Shakti. In truth, the nadis are not existent as static conduits awaiting activation. They arise as expressions of the goddess herself when she moves. When dormant, they do not exist for all practical purposes. They are latent in potential, awaiting the illumining stir of her grace. Thus, the descent of Kuņdalinī is not merely a metaphysical abstraction, but a cosmic coagulation, a sacred contraction into her own repose. The prana Shakti, streaming downward from the subtle womb of the Absolute, crystallizes the Suṣumna, coils inward and rests in stillness, dreamlike, yet potent, vibrant and fully aware. Tradition speaks of her as asleep. Though her slumber is not ignorance, it is a poised latency, a goddess in meditative absorption, dreaming this world into being. To comprehend the ascent, then, is to trace this process in reverse. Before we speak of the actual unfoldment, the diverse pathways, signs, and symptoms of the rising, what must first be contemplated is this metaphysical architecture, this grand design of descent that forms the sacred substratum of all subtle anatomy. When Shakti begins to stir, she does not rise out of some corner of the body, but reclaims the very paths she herself had laid down in her descent. Her ascent is a luminous remembrance of her own becoming. The inward spiral, Kuņdalinī is the power of consciousness returning to itself. Kuņdalinī, in her form as prana Shakti, descends into the field of multiplicity through the very pulse of chit Kuņdalinī, which vibrates at the frequency of self-aware consciousness. Her return, likewise, proceeds in stages, reabsorbing and reversing each phase of differentiation. Though Prana Kundalini gives rise to the totality of human embodiment, she must once again become Prana Kundalini in her awakened form to begin the return. It is vital to note that she is only called Prana Kundalini in this context when awakened, when her life force no longer moves outward in service of experience, but turns inward toward its source. In that reorientation, the incomprehensibly subtle resonance that had surged outward as Chit Śakti, as the power of knowing and perception, now begins to distill into acute awareness of self. When this occurs, she regains her quality as Chit Kundalini. This marks a moment of profound interiorization. Consciousness recognizing itself through the recollection of its own power. And as she ascends further, all movement begins to still, until Kundalini becomes once again Parā Kundalini, the non-differentiated pulsation of supreme will, Icha, knowledge, jnana, and action, Kriya, united as one. Thus, all three phases of Kundalini, Para, Chit, and Prana, are not merely abstract designations, but active dynamics within the arc of awakening. They are reflected in both cosmic unfolding and personal transformation. The reversal of her descent is not linear, nor is it bound by chronological time. These movements belong to the body of consciousness itself. And so one may ask, how does such a grand cosmological process translate into the lived immediacy of human experience? Does it unfold within the frameworks of time and lifespan? Here, Tantric insight touches hands with quantum science, for from the vantage of consciousness, there is no such thing as time in the way we commonly measure it. Kundalini creates time, along with space and all categories of manifestation. She is not subject to the temporal dimension. The phases of descent and ascent are simultaneous from her own perspective, happening not in time but in awareness. From the standpoint of the absolute, nothing ever happened, and yet from the standpoint of the aspirant, the return is experienced as a journey. That paradox is the fragrance of her enigma. Time, dream, and the relativity of awakening. This focal movement, the ascent of Kundalini, clearly takes place beyond the bounds of linear time. It does not adhere to the cadence of clock or calendar, but belongs to the eternal now of awareness. Just as in a dream, the time experienced by the dreamer is not the same that measured by the waking world. So too does the ascent of Kundalini unfold in a different register altogether. The one who dreams might live an entire story, a drama spanning years, within minutes of external time. Meanwhile, someone seated beside the dreamer reading a book has barely turned a page. This is the elasticity of time in altered states of consciousness. For the dreamer, the experience is real. Its texture, its arc, its emotion all feel authentic, yet they arise and dissolve in a time that is not constant. In much the same way, when Kundalini awakens and begins her inward journey, experiences may be profound, vast, even overwhelming, yet they unfold in a time that is no longer governed by planetary rotation or seasonal cycles. They occur in consecrated time, in Tantric Kala, where one moment can contain eternity and a lifetime may pass in a breath. This insight dissolves the seeming contradiction between metaphysical vision and personal journey. From the human perspective, the process may feel gradual, rising in intensity, revealing deeper layers, moving through initiatory phases. From the perspective of consciousness itself, however, there has been no movement at all. She, the self of all, never left her own fullness. The entire descent and ascent are seen to be a play within awareness, by awareness, for the sake of awareness. This too is why awakening so often arrives as a revelation of what has always been. It is not an achievement nor the culmination of effort, but the luminous recognition that this vibrant, pulsing awareness has been the ground of all that is. Nothing needed to be added. No attainment was ever required. The so-called seeker vanishes in the very instant it is seen that the one who searched was always already that which is sought. This is the essence of pratyabhinya, self-recognition, not as intellectual insight, but as the spontaneous, embodied realization that everything arises as an expression of pranada, the overflowing fullness of Shiva consciousness. It is not a fullness that negates the world, but one that shines as the world. As Abhinavagupta affirms, Sarvam idam Shiva eva. All this is none other than Shiva. When that is known, liberation is not attained, but recognized as ever present. From the Tantra Loka, I 142 through 143. In that moment, the seeming story of separation collapses. 142-3. In that moment, the seeming story of separation collapses, and what remains is the ever-present Svatantraya, the supreme freedom of awareness, awake to its own play. And so the timeless self does not emerge, it is simply uncovered, as the only reality that ever was. The personal and transpersonal currents of the Kuņdalinī process. The Kuņdalinī process bears two unmistakable facets, one deeply personal, the other unmistakably transpersonal. On the one hand, it speaks directly to the body, to the visceral lived experience of being. On the other, it reveals dimensions that are vast, impersonal, and transcendent, flowing beyond the limits of biography or personality. It goes without saying, the very purpose of this book is to offer a compass for those navigating this terrain, to orient and support the sincere aspirant as they encounter and undergo this beatific unfolding. For that, the metaphysical perspective must be established. One cannot truly understand what is taking place on the ground, so to speak, without glimpsing the vastness in which it is held. The metaphysical view is the lamp that lightens the path and also reveals that path is already within. Once that broader context has been sufficiently revealed, we can settle into a more experiential unfolding, speaking to the uniqueness of each individual's journey. It is here that the personal meets the transpersonal. First, however, it is crucial to establish that it is not the person that awakens. It is Kuņdalinī herself as consciousness, who stirs from her dream. The me who speaks of awakening is, more often than not, simply the voice attempting to reconcile what cannot be grasped through the lens of identity. When this understanding begins to dawn, not just conceptually, but viscerally, then the path clears itself. The apparent fragmentation of experience becomes luminous with meaning, and the process begins to orient around its own culmination, the merging of subject and object in the pure light of self-recognition. There must be a willingness to surrender to what is real. The awakened Kuņdalinī is not striving to maintain her individuality. She is longing to melt, to dissolve, to return. This is the impulse of every wave toward the ocean, of every flame toward its source. Yet language, with its fixed structures and temporal bias, keeps reasserting the I. The I am going through this, the I am having a Kuņdalinī awakening. If not carefully regarded, this might recrystallize into narratives involving a persona and a construct of time. And when that happens, the immediacy of the process is diminished and the transmission is diluted by interpretation. This is why the shift in perception must be deep, unmistakable, and abiding. Only then can one rest as that which is prior to all movement, yet unafraid of any movement that arises. The experience of prana, of subtle shifts, of surges and flows, of tremors and expansions will still occur, but they are no longer framed within the identity of the one who is experiencing. They are simply the play of Śakti within her own field, free, spontaneous, self-arising. The Coiled one, Reexamining the language of Withinness. This is an important redressing of orientation, one to which we shall return again and again, for the metaphor of Kuņdalinī being coiled within has taken on a life of its own, often solidifying into a literal image, rather than being honored for the depth of insight it was originally meant to convey. To navigate this terrain with integrity, one must learn to separate the wheat from the chaff, to discern between poetic symbolism, scriptural allegory, and the immediate phenomenology of lived experience. We must be vigilant not to become victims of the very language that was designed to liberate. As the sage Ramana Maharshi poignantly observed, Kuņdalinī is another name for Atma, or self, or Śakti. We talk of it, Kuņdalinī, as being inside the body because we conceive ourselves as limited to the body. But it is in reality both inside and outside, being no other than the self, or Śakti. Gems from Bhagavan, page 46. As long as we take ourselves to be someone housed in a body, then naturally the language we use reflects that presumption. From that standpoint, the Kuņdalinī process appears as something internal, hidden, latent, awaiting activation within the coils of our nervous system. But this, though not untrue, is only a partial truth. It reflects a stage of perception still bound by duality, still rooted in the subject-object divide. The withinness of Kuņdalinī is not spatial, it is ontological. She is coiled not merely at the base of the spine, but at the very root of manifestation, at the threshold where awareness differentiates into knower and known. Her repose is the still point at which time begins to move, at which being begins to feel itself as becoming. What we call the symptomatology of the Kuņdalinī process, the energetic stirrings, the surges of prana, the shifts in breath, perception, or consciousness, are reflections of this more primordial movement. They are not the thing itself, but the supreme gestures of her stirring. These movements are facilitated by the 5 principal vuyas, the pranic currents which govern the entire psychophysical organism. They act as emissaries of Shakti's intent, guiding and conducting her impulse through the matrix of subtle anatomy. But even these currents are not autonomous. They are animated by the same primordial wave, by that very throb, spanda, which issued forth at the moment of first differentiation. So when we speak of Kuņdalinī as coiled within, let it not be a reification. Let it be an evocation, a poetic doorway that points to a principle of unbound mystery. Let it direct our gaze inward, yes, but also beyond body, beyond breath, beyond even the mind that seeks to understand. Śakti Kuņdalinī is the pulse of consciousness, Parā-Aparā, and the threshold of becoming. At this pivotal juncture in our contemplation, let us attune to the exquisite subtlety of Śakti Kuņdalinī, the intermediary force that holds within herself the double gesture of creation and dissolution. It is here, in this poised middle ground, that the pulse of consciousness, spanda, vibrates with its most refined intensity. Śakti Kuņdalinī is not simply the energy in transition between the transcendent and the immanent. She is the very principle of transition, the arc of awareness about to differentiate into the play of experience. Tradition names her Parā-Aparā, the supreme and the non-supreme. This paradoxical designation is key, for it signifies her dual capacity, to dissolve into the stillness of her source or to erupt into the manifoldness of manifestation. She is the one who stands at the cusp, where unity quivers toward multiplicity, where the unmanifest begins its descent into time and form. Once again, it is crucial here to realize that Śakti Kuņdalinī is not merely a bridge between phases of energy. She is consciousness itself, Chit Śakti, in its aspect of pure sentience. And that sentience bears within it the innate potential to either contract or expand, to remain indivisible, or to become the mirror through which the one knows itself as many. In yogic language, this poised state is symbolized by bindu, the point, the dot, the seed of all potential. The bindu Visarga, the point of emission, is that exact moment where vibration awakens from stillness, where subject and object are yet not, but the possibility of their arising begins to stir. And in that moment, consciousness wavers. Shall it remain whole, or shall it know itself through the mirror of separation? Śakti Kuņdalinī is that moment of creative tension. In her lies the latent divergence of awareness into experiencer and experience. She is the scintillating dot that both is and is not, poised to return to undivided unity or to burst forth as the cosmos. It is not a movement in time, but a condition of infinite readiness, where consciousness hovers at the edge of its own overflow. This is the numinous hesitation before the word is spoken, the breath held at the lips of being before it exhales worlds into being. It is precisely here, in this balancing of stillness and surge, that the most profound understanding of Kuņdalinī can be felt, not as something to awaken, ascend, or master, but as the very ground of our own potential to be. Visarga, the emission and return, descent into form, ascent into source. To comprehend the necessity of Kuņdalinī's ascent, we must first understand her descent. For nothing returns unless it has issued forth. No movement toward union is possible without a primordial gesture of differentiation. This infinite pulse of issuing forth and returning is encoded in the very heart of Tantric metaphysics and is known by the name Visarga. Visarga is not an event, nor even a state, it is a principle. It refers to the emission of awareness as it bursts forth from its own fullness, propelled by the inner friction of Shiva and Śakti, of the witnessing stillness and the dynamic pulse of being. That friction, the creative tension within consciousness itself, produces a primal quiver, the first throb, which then becomes the seed of all manifestation. At its most refined, Visarga occurs at a level far subtler than form or even thought. It is the originary wave, the cosmic spanda, born of the caress between Shiva and Śakti. And just as this friction gives rise to the world, so too does it leave its trace in us, in the human body and breath, in every inhalation and exhalation, in the momentary stillness between the two. The descent of Kuņdalinī is not solely an event within the body. It is the very act through which the body, the breath, and the world are brought into being. Her descent is the primordial Visarga, the emission of consciousness into form, which gives rise to the intricate design of existence itself. The body is not a pre-existing vessel into which she enters, rather it is shaped through her movement, woven from the very currents of prana as she pours herself downward in the act of creation. This is how Kuņdalinī, in her repose, lies coiled at the base of the spine, as the latent residue of her own descent into manifestation. She flows into the bodily form through a myriad of subtle pathways, nadis, which, in their dormant state, exist only as unlit potentials, waiting to be illumined by her touch. Chief among these is Susumna, the central channel, which is not a static conduit, and even though finer than the spider's filament, is like a living river, formed by her descent, sustained by her presence, and destined to become the path of her ascent. It is through this vertical axis that the arc of creation will one day invert itself and begin its return to the source. When she descends, she contracts, coiling at the base of the spine, symbolically asleep, yet alive with latent power, not in a sleep of ignorance, but in self-containment, having wrapped herself in the dream of form, waiting for the moment when the body-mind becomes transparent enough for her to stir once more. And when she rises, it is not through new invention, but through retracing her own footsteps. The ascent follows the exact trace of descent in reverse. The breath, prana, becomes her steed. The channels awaken one by one only as she moves through them. Until then, they are but subtle possibilities, invisible threads in the tapestry of embodiment. This reveals a profound secret. The structure of our subtle body is not a given. It is a living responsiveness to Kuņdalinī herself. Where she is moved, a path emerges. Where she rests, a center shines. Without her, there is no pathway, no nadi, no chakra, no ladder to climb. The inner anatomy awakens in her light. The sacred arc, from prana to chit to Parā-Aparā, the reclaiming of the one. As Kuņdalinī stirs from her repose at the base of the spine, it is not a movement towards something unknown, but a return to what has always been, her own self. The ascent begins as Prāņa Kuņdalinī, for breath as her first expression within embodiment. But the breath now, ignited from within, is not ordinary breath. It is the awakened movement of the life force, remembering itself as light. This phase of ascent, as it rides the currents of prana, is a reanimation of divine architecture. The subtle pathways begin to vibrate with a luminosity they did not previously possess. As Prāņa Kuņdalinī ascends, she gradually regains her awareness of being Chit Kuņdalinī, consciousness itself. Chit Kuņdalinī is the intermediary. She is the balance point, the axis point which the dual movements of manifestation and reabsorption turn. When this aspect of Kuņdalinī awakens, one begins to experience a fundamental shift. The sense of agency gives way to witnessing. Knowledge no longer arises from thought, but from resonance, and action becomes spontaneous, suffused with presence. This is the domain of Śakti as Chit, vibrant awareness, fully perceiving itself, yet still dancing in polarity. At this juncture, the power may either fall back into the dream of duality or ascend further into the non-dual radiance of the Supreme. When Kuņdalinī continues her ascent beyond Chit, she merges into Parā Kuņdalinī, the Supreme. This is not a movement in space or time, but the extinguishing of the illusion of movement altogether. For Parā is that in which all arising and dissolving takes place, yet which itself neither arises nor dissolves. It is the unstruck silence at the heart of all becoming. Here, the coiled power dissolves into the formless flame. The throb, spanda, that gave rise to the play of manifestation is now recognized as nothing other than the quiescent pulse of awareness itself, never separate from its own repose. Subject and object vanish into pure subjectivity, where awareness rests as the luminous ground of all appearances. This is the completion of the arc. What descended as Parā, differentiated as Chit, and embodied as Prāṇa, now reascends through the very body she once veiled herself in. It is not an escape from the world, but the world illumined from within, revealed as her own exhalation. Thus the body becomes a shrine, the breath becomes a mantra, and life becomes the living sacrament of return. Yet let it be understood, this arc is not measured in years, lifetimes, or epochs. It is not bound by the linearity of time. For Kuņdalinī is not evolving, she is revealing. And what she reveals is not something new, but what has always been the case. Beneath the veil of fragmentation, the undivided reality has never ceased to shine. Beyond time, awakening as the revelation of what has always been. A natural question arises: if this arc of descent and ascent is real, where does it take place? How long does it require? Is it stretched across lifetimes, or does it unfold in some fathomless immediacy? These questions surface naturally because the mind translates movement through the only grammar it knows, that of time. Yet here, the teachings of Tantra brush quietly against the boundary where time fails. For Kuņdalinī does not move in time, she is the one who births time, the universe and its cycles by the very act of sequencing. Long before the pulse of separation, before the first tremor of I, aham, the world, idam, there was no succession, no before or after. There was only presence. Time arises the moment awareness bends toward differentiation. With that subtle curvature, kala, the principle of limitation, gives rise to kala, time, and the universe begins to spin. Borrowing the insight from lesser-known Trika doctrines, that of Kramavada, this unfolding is seen as the power of Kali herself, the devourer of sequence, whose very dance brings the cycles of becoming into play. Yet even Kali must bow to reality as it is prior to time, the still point without circumference. To speak then of the ascent of Kuņdalinī is not to narrate a sequence. It is to indicate a shift so radical that the axis of awareness reverses its direction. What had been oriented around becoming reorients into being. When Kuņdalinī awakens as Chit, not merely within consciousness, time does not end. It is rendered porous. Duration gives way to depth. Movement becomes modulation, and in that depth, what appeared as an arc reveals itself as simultaneity. Even breath is differently lived. No longer counted as intervals between past and future, it is felt as the pulse of presence itself, rising and falling within a stillness that does not move. From the vantage of consciousness, there is no waiting, no gradual approach towards some future state. The process we live as unfolding is often the body's translation of what has already been recognized at the level of being. Physiologically, there may be stages. Psychologically, there may be thresholds. But existentially, awakening is the revelation of what has always been so. To ask, how long does it take, is therefore to ask from inside the dream. The more pertinent question is, what shifts when time loosens its hold? When what we perceive as evolution is seen less as a journey and more as a deepening sobriety of perception. Awakening then is not something that happens, it is something that is remembered, and not remembered as in a past event recalled, but as a timeless truth that has always been the case. This is why so many who awaken repeat a similar refrain. It has always been like this. It is the revelation not of something new, but of something eternally present, that which had been obscured by the veil of identification. Here, even the language of descent and ascent falls short. These are not movements through space, but movements in consciousness. The dreamer does not move from one dream to another. He awakens and realizes he has always been the dreamer, untouched by the content of the dream. Likewise, Kuņdalinī in her awakened state reveals not merely energy coursing through channels, but the very substrate of the dream, awareness dreaming itself as the play of life. This revelation undermines the tyranny of time. The framework of hours, years, or even notion of spiritual progress becomes almost quaint. What seemed like progress was preparation. What seemed like seeking was the spiraling path of return. The beauty of Tantra lies in this. Even that which appears as delay or distraction is also her. Kuņdalinī is not only the goal, but the journey, the yearning, the struggle, the glimpses, the forgetting. All of it is her play, and all of it leads back to her. Therefore, one must be cautious not to reduce the process of Kuņdalinī to a personal adventure, for it is not the person who awakens. It is awareness awakening to itself, through the contraction we call the person. When this is understood, our orientation shifts. No longer obsessed with my experience, one begins to perceive the process as the unfolding of that, the impersonal intelligence that animates all beings. To mistake the process as mine is to fall back into fragmentation. This is why language can be both a bridge and a barrier. It crystallizes experience into narrative and narrative into identity. But awakened Kuņdalinī is not interested in identity. She longs only to merge, to dissolve, to return. This is not annihilation, but completion. It is the lover reunited with the beloved, the wave returning to the ocean, the spark falling back into the flame. And then when this return occurs, when Kuņdalinī is no longer spoken of as mine or yours, but simply known as that, then the process has fulfilled its aim. Let us, before moving forward, sit for a moment at the threshold where understanding gives way to reverence. Everything spoken thus far on descent and ascent, emission and reabsorption, wave and particle is but the faint echo of a truth that vibrates in silence, a truth that is not grasped, but lived. Kuņdalinī, in her profound mystery, is not a concept to be pinned down, nor a force to be manipulated. She is not the exclusive property of any culture, any tradition, or any era. She moves beneath names and beyond forms, igniting the hearts of seers, saints, shamans, and lovers of truth the world over. She is the pulse in the breath, the fire in the spine, the shimmer behind the gaze. She is the mother of awakening and the midwife of return. To speak of her is to walk a razor's edge between clarity and awe, between language and that which language cannot contain. And yet speak we must, for our times call for remembrance, and the human heart, weary of fragmentation, longs again to be whole. This inquiry, this transmission, is a quiet invitation to see that which is stirring within you as not merely personal. It is archetypal. It is cosmic. It is the one longing to know itself through the many. And if you find yourself here reading these words, it may well be that she is already rising, not in a rush of experience, but as a deep attunement to what has always been alive within you, veiled perhaps, but never absent. Trust then that the unfolding is not yours to force, but to honor. What must flower will flower, and what must dissolve will dissolve. For Kuņdalinī is not separate from who you are. She is your very essence, curled into the root of being, dreaming herself into time so that she might awaken as you. Let us carry this remembrance gently, like a flame, cupped in the palms of our breath. And with that flame, we may step into what comes next. Symbolism of fire, sun, and moon, and three goddesses. At a certain point in our evolutionary unfolding, there must have come a shift from gazing outward into the phenomena of the world to unlock its mysteries, to turning inward in reverence, entering the vast universe within. This inward gaze sought to explore the marvel of consciousness on all its planes, sensation, thought, feeling, and beyond. Perhaps this is the greatest gift offered to the modern West by what is often referred to as Oriental wisdom, particularly that which flourished on the Indian subcontinent. For when Western science, driven by objectivity, extended its instruments ever deeper into the cosmos and constructed ever more sophisticated probes into the quantum domain, it encountered an unexpected truth. Matter itself melts into patterns of frequency, vibration, and energy. What appears solid dissolves upon close inspection. Even what we call empty space, a single cubic centimeter of vacuum, holds more energy than the cosmos we can observe. These, by now familiar revelations, are electrifying, but only truly to the extent that they resonate with the deeper discovery of who and what we are. If such insights remain abstract, intellectually stimulating yet severed from embodied reality, they must eventually be unlearned, or rather released from the grasp of the rational mind to make way for lived knowing. For unless they take root in the soil of direct experience, they cannot meaningfully contribute to a shared vision of fulfillment, one capable of reshaping the force of human destiny through a deeper, unified purpose. In the view of Tantric Śaivism, what quantum theory and post-material science are only beginning to glimpse is that reality is woven of vibratory fields, relational patterns, and a non-local intelligence, long known as the very pulsation, sponda, of consciousness. What the physicist perceives as energy, probability, and entanglement, the tantric seer recognizes as Śakti, the creative vibration of awareness becoming aware of itself through the universe of forms. Reality, in this understanding, is not built from inert matter, but from the ceaseless throbbing of sentient light, perpetually contracting and expanding within the field of its own recognition. This movement is not mechanical or impersonal, but the intrinsic throb of awareness described in the Spanda Karikas as the eternal pulse of Shiva, expressing himself through diversity. In this vision, there is no gap between observer and observed. All phenomena, whether sensory or suprasensory, are differentiated modulations of one self-luminous essence. Where contemporary physics speaks of energy fields and informational matrices, Tantric Śaivism speaks of Icha, Jnana, and Kriya, will, knowledge, and action, as the dynamic triad through which the one becomes the many, while never ceasing to be itself. This is not an abstract metaphysic divorced from life or embodiment. On the contrary, the body is the very site of revelation, a living prism through which the infinite radiance of awareness refracts into form. Rather than an obstacle to transcend, it is the beatified vessel of transmission, where every nerve, breath, and pulsation can become a mantra of remembrance. The relationship between prana, kundalini, and breath constitutes a precise and profound science within the tantric tradition. Breath here is not simply the mechanical intake of air, but the expressed visible trace of an invisible current of life force in motion. And while the comprehensive survey of all internal yogic anatomies found across Indic traditions lies beyond our present scope, we will draw upon key frameworks that serve to illuminate the depth and refinement of this vision. Before we turn to these models, let us recall something immediate, something we all share, the movement of breath itself. This rhythmic rising and falling, the subtle to and fro of inhalation and exhalation mirrors a deeper pulsation within consciousness. It evokes that primordial polarity between Shiva and Śakti, the stillness and the surge, the silent witness and the creative throb. This dynamic arises from Svatantriya, Shiva's boundless freedom, expressing itself as the threefold powers through which infinite potential begins to stir into manifest form. Recall how Para-Kundalini gives rise to Śakti Kundalini, the latter shimmering as the point of equipoise between stillness and becoming. She is ever poised, either to dissolve back into the incomprehensible void of Para, or to cascade outward as creation. When Śakti heeds the impulse to manifest, awareness, Shiva, contracts, concealing its own boundless nature beneath layers of form. Yet when those forms dissolve, awareness is no longer veiled. It reclaims its own face, luminous and undivided. This pulsation between emergence and withdrawal is not only cosmological, but must be inscribed within our neurophysiology and subtle anatomy so that the journey of return can be initiated from within. According to the Shaiva Tantras, the whole cosmic manifestation is a play of divine unfolding and return. From Para, the supreme unmanifest, to Śakti, the power to manifest, to Prana, the vital current, to form, and back again through the same arc in perfect reversal. This profound circuit moves not in linearity but is cyclical, an eternal rhythm where the same power that descends into embodiment also charts the way home. It is through this triadic dynamic that Shiva, having emanated himself into multiplicity, reclaims his wholeness as Paramasiva. For this reason, adepts, whether inclined toward knowledge, jnanis, or action, kriyavans, contemplate this dynamic not as philosophy alone, but as direct realization, a vision of how awareness unveils itself in stages of self-revelation, self-discovery, and finally self-recognition. From the perspective of Kashmir Shaivism, the human being is not an accident or cosmic misstep. We are awareness, Shiva, concealed within and as manifestation for the sake of this human experience, and perhaps as that cosmic balancing point between emergence and return, something that would require an insightful reflection and thorough elaboration. As the third facet in the triad of Shiva, Shakti, Nara, the individual, is essential to the process of self-revelation. Without our embodied participation, the self is but an inert bystander, at least from a tantric perspective, which reflects earlier Vedic praxis. This restores the dignity of human birth and existence. In the words of the tradition, nothing exists that is not Shiva. All phenomena, manifest or subtle, are the self. We as human beings are no different. When we hold this grand vision, this epistemological context, the subtler aspects of practice come into clearer view. We are then able to perceive at every level how awareness may remain concealed, for concealment itself could be seen as part and parcel of self-recognition. Next, let us revisit a well-known yogic perspective to deepen our understanding of inner anatomy, the trinity of solar, lunar, and fiery energies that underlie all forms of yoga. For instance, in the science of Hatha Yoga, the union of Ha and Tha, symbolized by the subtle currents of Ida and Pingala, points to the merging of lunar and solar streams. We speak of the metabolizing quality of fire, Agni, the reflective and nourishing qualities of the moon, Soma, and the life-imbuing vitality of the sun, Surya. These are not merely poetic archetypes, but lived energetic realities. Solar energy imbues us with prana, vigor and illuminating clarity. Lunar energy permeates us with nectar, sap, and a sense of appeasement. Fire is the inner flame of transformation, digesting not only food, but also impressions, desires, and karmic residues. At the level of subtle anatomy, these essences mirror the triadic pulsation of knower, pramatur, means of knowledge, pramana, and known, prameya, as the object of knowledge, which, as has been expounded on previously, is the fundamental rhythm of manifestation in Trika metaphysics. Now to locate these three quintessential energies, fire, sun, and moon, in the living design of the subtle body. Fire resides at the root, in Muladhara. Although that chakra is traditionally associated with the element of earth and linked to the sense of smell, its deeper essence is born of elemental fire. Just as the surface of the earth conceals molten magma beneath, so too does the base chakra rest upon the igniting presence of Śakti in her fierce, dynamic form. In Tantric Śaivism, she is Bhairavī, the luminous consort of Bhairava, and the sovereign of the subterranean flame. It is she who rests as the coiled Kuņdalinī, holding in her repose the blueprint of the entire cosmos. When awakened, her energy rises upward, intense and undeniable, consuming, purifying, and reshaping perception from its very roots. At the heart, Hridaya, the radiant sun, finds its seat, not as a ball of fire, but as an inner luminosity, the illuminating power of Śakti, or pure knowing. This is not the empirical mind, but consciousness revealing itself to itself. In Trika, this innermost heart is often referred to as Anuttara Hridaya, the ultimate core of being, where the pulse of awareness never ceases. Here, the goddess Kali reigns, not in her ferocious form alone, but as the devourer of time, Kala, and the revealer of timelessness. She is the throb of pure recognition, Pratayobhijna, the one who liberates by severing the knot of duality in the very seat of selfhood. Abhinavagupta writes in Tantraloka I 251, Kali is that supreme power who dances in the heart of a yogi, swallowing time and revealing the unbroken stream of awareness. In this light, Kali is not a terrifying force, but the sovereign power, Svatantraya Śakti, that reveals all things as her own expression. The heart becomes her seat not through sentiment, but through recognition, that all experience arises and dissolves within the spacious field of awareness, untouched and whole. At the crown of Sahasrara abides the lunar principle as Soma, diffusing nectar, Amrita, appeasing the fires below and bestowing the taste of Purnata, fullness. In Kaula Trika sources, this is often correlated with Bindu, sometimes Bindu Visarga, in the cranial vault, the subtle secretion released when the inner seals are loosened and the current of Kuņdalinī moves unimpeded. It is the subtlest saturation of awareness in its own bliss. When the lunar current is unveiled, all striving is stilled, for its light discloses the fullness that was never lost. These three, fire, sun, and moon, are thus not fixed symbols, but living gateways in the play of Śakti, each reflecting a phase in the endless self-dialogue of awareness. In the Śakti tradition of Dasha Mahavidya, the 10 great wisdom goddesses who personify the manifold powers of the divine feminine, Kali, Tripurasundari, and Bhairavī, are revered among these archetypal expressions of transcendental consciousness. Within that current, Tripurasundari represents the luminous mirror of awareness itself, the radiance of beauty through which Shiva recognizes himself. By analogical correspondence, she may be included here alongside Bhairavī and Kali, not as a formal figure within the Trika lineage, but as a symbolic expression of the same reflective principle. For in the Trika vision, the 10 Mahavidyas themselves are understood as differentiated emanations of Para-Shakti, facets of the same all-pervasive consciousness. Their respective Shaktis flow and interchange according to the movement of consciousness itself. In manifestation, each Shakti empowers the descent, followed by jnana and kriya, from will to knowledge to action. In reabsorption, the current reverses. Each Shakti becomes the flame that propels the return. Jnana illumines the path, and kriya draws the soul back into its original longing to know itself as Shiva. This is the subtle alchemy of ascent and descent, the concealment and revelation, played out through the currents of breath and the stirrings of Kuņdalinī. In this mapping, fire, sun, and moon represent not only energetic functions, but are facets of the eternal triad of seer, seeing, and seen. The knower is Icha, awareness stirred by the will to behold itself. The means of knowledge is jnana, the radiant insight that bridges subject and object. The known is kriya, the dynamic power by which the formless takes shape. Yet these are not compartments, but pulsations of one reality. Shakti endlessly turning upon herself. As Mark Dyczkowski elucidates in his scholarly debut, these three are appropriately symbolized as three great luminaries, namely the fire, sun, and moon. The means of knowledge, like the sun, illumines the object. The object shines like the moon by its reflected light. Fire aptly symbolizes the subject. The Doctrine of Vibration, 1987, page 64. In this way, the triad of Icha, Jnana, and Kriya finds its luminous analog in the very design of perception. Fire as the witnessing subject, sun as the ray of cognition, and moon as the reflective manifestation of the known. This symbolism encapsulates the very heart of Trika metaphysics, the seamless unity of perception where awareness, its operation, and its manifestation are understood as a single continuum of divine vibration, spanda. Dyczkowski notes that Abhinavagupta uses the imagery to reconcile cosmology with epistemology. Fire, sun, and moon are not celestial metaphors alone, but inner dimensions of cognition and embodiment. Their interplay within the practitioner mirrors the cosmic process of emanation and reabsorption, illustrating how knowledge itself is the mode by which Shiva comes to recognize his own fullness through Shakti. Each center of the subtle body, each goddess abiding in her sphere, is a portal through which Shakti recognizes herself in all that appears. The entire subtle physiology thus becomes a living mandala of recognition, where nothing is outside of that which perceives, that which knows, and that which brings itself forth into form. Esoteric anatomy of the breath, proper ascent versus falling Kuņdalinī. What transpires beneath the surface level when we breathe, when breath in all its refinement becomes the medium of the inner alchemy. What we touched upon earlier now begins to deepen. Prana Kuņdalinī in its essence is not separate from the breath. Indeed, it unfolds through stages of inward refinement. Just as Shakti Kuņdalinī gives rise to Prana Kuņdalinī in her intention to pour outward and into and as the world, so too does the awakened Kuņdalinī mark the reversal of that cosmic trajectory. This upwelling is preceded by progressive internalization, a major realignment of pranic currents within that readies the dormant power to aspire to a return journey. This reversal echoes the very movement that gave rise to external manifestation. This living soul, Jiva, this Nara, when Shakti's creative impulse has shaken its equilibrium and splintered unity towards what would become subject and object, at the unfolding phase of manifestation. At its root, genuine Kuņdalinī awakening requires a threshold of internalized force powerful enough for it to pierce the inner centers and ascend to its rightful sanctuary. This insight disrupts a common misconception that Kuņdalinī might awaken incidentally as we rush through life juggling work, relationships, responsibilities, travel, while the inner stream stirs on its own. Such an expectation belongs to glamorized myth, not lived reality. True awakening cannot proceed in the midst of chaos or distraction. We will explore the scriptural basis for this, as well as the lived testimony of modern adepts and mystics, to understand why true ascent demands dwelling in a field of inner stillness, which, at a certain phase, requires that stillness in our immediate environment as well. Now, as the upsurging wave of consciousness is poised to awaken from its latent slumber, we turn to a key valve in the subtle system, the lambika. This is the juncture where breath can pivot from the lunar, left, to the solar, right, channel, and crucially, into the central channel, susumna. Yet often the right side valve remains constricted, the solar pathway blocked, the lunar channel dominant, and the central path unrealized. Only when breath reaches a perfect equilibrium, when the subtle currents of moon, sun, and fire merge, does the lambika valve open fully. In that moment, the field becomes ripe for the full luminous awakening of Kuņdalinī. Without such integration, any rise remains partial, circuitous, and incomplete, never truly enacting the full ascent of divine force. Lambika, sometimes referred to as talu or taluka, the sacred hinge, anatomically corresponding to the soft palate, the fleshy part of the roof of the mouth, is not merely a subtle junction, it is the energetic switchboard that governs the passage between duality and unity. According to Tantric Śaivism, it is also the hidden seed of duality itself, lodged in the subtler dimension of breath. So long as prana oscillates between left and right, ida and pingala, it sustains the illusion of separateness. But when lambika is awakened, the polarity of breath collapses into the still axis of susumna, and the gateway to non-duality swings open from within. Many meditators encounter this familiar yet profound phenomenon. After entering stillness, the breath becomes exquisitely refined, and then, as if by itself, seems to pause. This arrest in breathing is not the result of strain or effort. Our path, unlike certain hatha yoga methods, does not impose such control. Instead, when the field is ripe, when inner conditions have matured, a spontaneous stillness descends. The meditator finds that inhalation and exhalation cease, as though the breath has simply found rest. At that pivotal moment, when the breath is suspended and pressure arises at the lambika on the right solar channel, prana is compelled downward. Immediately, the lambika opens into susumna, and the collected subtle energies, the lunar, solar, and fiery essences, cascade into the central pathway. The resulting alchemical combustion awakens Kuņdalinī from her latent repose. All 5 pranas converge in a luminous focal point between the navel and Muladhara. In that convergence, Udana, which normally ascends from the solar plexus to the nasal aperture, reverses and descends to unite with Kuņdalinī. This union becomes Urdhva Kuņdalinī, ascending Kuņdalinī, and begins its swift journey upward, center by center. If, however, the inner field has not been correctly prepared, the awakening of Kuņdalinī may unfold in a less desirable manner. As Swami Lakshmanju taught, there are 2 principal trajectories. In the ideal unfolding, what might be called a properly aligned ascent, the pranic forces are realigned and drawn downward to Muladhara, where Kuņdalinī awakens and begins her luminous ascent through susumna, rising center by center to merge with the Supreme. Yet in other cases, particularly when the energetic pathways remain blocked and the overall system imbalanced, the awakening may follow a disordered trajectory. The surge bypasses the root altogether, leaping directly to the ajna center, the so-called third eye, before reversing course and falling back toward the base. Though such episodes may be accompanied by seeing lights, visions, and other subtle phenomena, they lack the coherent activation of each center and do not yield full integration. This form of premature inverted rising may simulate spiritual awakening, yet leaves the soul without the anchoring needed for deep transformation. Only when the ascent is whole, when the fire is lit at the base and rises in a sustained current through each psychic center, can Kundalini enact her role as the bridge between embodied self and the unconditioned self. This process echoes a widely spread Western model, popularized by a notable Bay Area teacher, in which awakening proceeds in a so-called downward movement. This view gained momentum and began to be referred to by other peers in the field as head awakening, heart awakening, and gut awakening in that sequence. When I first encountered this framing, I sensed it belied a misunderstanding, or precisely what Swami Lakshmanju called a faulty or adha Kundalini, literally falling Kundalini. This interpretation finds validation in Kashmir Shaiva scripture and in the writings of Swami Lakshmanju himself, especially as presented in Self-Realization in Kashmir Shaivism, page 109. The truly aligned Urdhva Kundalini is the upward process, center by center. In contrast, Adha's, downward, is classified as entirely undesirable. It not only bypasses most of the energy centers, but most importantly does not give access to the Sahasrara. As a result, it lacks the inherent siddhis, those spontaneous powers that accompany true ascent. Worse, it may become a recurring loop, decade after decade. The energy repeatedly surges into ajna only to fall back, never reaching the crown. And crossing each center, it does not become absorbed into that center, as in a proper ascent. That absorption is crucial, for psychic information contained therein is integrated into the unfolding Śakti. This insight gives rise to a vital correction concerning the popular chakra discourse. The Kashmir Shaiva Tantras clearly assert chakras remain idle, latent, unless Kundalini traverses through them. Thus, modern rhetoric about activating chakras or holding chakra workshops is, scripturally speaking, a novel invention of the New Age. True, the human form holds all the energetic centers. They correspond to the tattvas, the elements of ether, air, fire, water, earth, and beyond. But activation occurs only through Kundalini's passage. Without it, one may exhibit behaviors, sensitivities, even talents, but without consciousness, the inner intelligence of those centers remains untouched. The person remains identified with the body, lacking the illumination that Shakti's movement brings. Only the passage of true Kundalini through each center releases its fullness. It is only natural to ask, what contributes to a proper ascent? True Urdhva Kundalini, and why do some experiences manifest as faulty or fallen awakenings? For a deeper understanding, we can turn to Kundalini Vidya, as taught by Joan Shivarpita Harrigan, who studied Kundalini Vidya with a master in India. This little-known tradition offers a detailed map of ascent variations, highlighting how Susumna is structured and how deviations can occur. Yet in popular discourse, a simplified narrative often emerges. Kundalini is supreme intelligence. Whatever happens, happens by divine decree. While this may sound hopeful, it overlooks the critical relationship between Kundalini and the nervous system, the very infrastructure through which energy moves. Without acknowledging this interplay, we risk romanticizing awakenings as miraculous, rather than recognizing the majority of experience one shaped by personal conditioning, temperament, and energetic contexts. True, very rarely a spontaneous, effortless ascent may happen, but it is not the norm. In most cases, awakenings are met with resistance, congestion at energetic knots, granthi, that corresponds to psychological imprints, samskaras or vasanas. 3 such knots at Muladhara, the heart, and the Buramida ajna are known as Brahma Granthi, Vishnu Granthi, and Rudra Granthi, respectively. These knots impede Kundalini's effortless rise. It takes focused energy, prana, concentrated and refined, to pierce Beda, these centers. In Kashmir Shaivism, each center may be pierced through initiation, sustained effort, direct yogic transmission from an adept, or exposure to certain stimuli as a subtle form of sound, sabda, or sight, darsana. A truly aligned ascent does not merely require prana flow. As Swami Lakshmanju remarked, without adherence to yamas and niyamas, the internal and external ethical foundation, The process becomes prone to distortion from the start. These practices are not arbitrary morality. They form structural supports that align us with Rita, universal truth. When prana is realigned, not just physically coalesced, but morally and ethically clarified, it becomes capable of igniting true awakening. This is the marriage of internalization and realignment, prana and insight moving together. We can illustrate this with any creative endeavor. Across all spheres of creation, no true act of self-expression unfolds without first realigning one's creative energies. Otherwise, it dissipates. You may chase ideas. I want to write an essay, compose a symphony, paint a picture, but unless you actually gather and channel that creative flow, nothing tangible emerges. This principle applies equally to transformation of consciousness. Without progressive internalization and realignment, one cannot expect the full manifestation of Śakti as Visarga, that impulse of creative intelligence that underlies every creation. Spiritual emergence is no exception. This may seem harsh, but it speaks to a modern reality. Many claimed awakenings are simply wishful thinking or emotional projections. As Swami Lakshmanju pointed out, what often occurs as Śakti prematurely surging upward only to fall back. In my work, especially during our live immersions, I meet many who say, I had a Kuņdalinī experience 6 months ago or 6 years ago, or I felt the energy rising. What I consistently observe are partial, cyclical surges, misleadingly intense, yet not the full arc of authentic awakening. Unfortunately, in our era where anything goes, we must distinguish between symptom and substance, between novelty and genuine transformation. True, full-bodied awakening requires realignment and internalization. If someone says, I tripped on LSD, I did an ayahuasca ceremony, I had wild sex, or I attended a retreat and something spiritual happened, these are not genuine Kuņdalinī awakenings. A proper awakening comes only after sustained progressive deepening of breath, lifestyle, focus, and yes, withdrawal. Just as artists often need solitude to birth their work, so consciousness withdraws from habitual distractions to wake into itself. This is why our teaching and the research behind this work places such emphasis on ethics, diet, relationships, and lifestyle. In our live immersions, we create a field, a laboratory of alignment, refinement, and recalibration. Here, misguided energies can be